Real soldiers were enraged by this, anachronistic, out-of-place, rare, prototype weapons everywhere. How this game got away with so many blatant errors is beyond me. The game begins with our African-American character of the US 369th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, receiving flashbacks to his service during the First World War upon hearing the song Dream a Little Dream of Me. However, this song was written in 1931, with the version used in-game being the one sung by Margaret Bimham for the soundtrack of the modern-day TV show Boardwalk Empire, and is thus anachronistic on two terms. This hospital sequence could be post-war, but a more appropriate choice would be any number of war songs created or popularized during the Great War. It's never specified exactly where we are in this prologue chapter. However, based on the environment, 1918 year setting presented, general location on the map in the menu, and the fact that we are playing as Harlem Hellfighter soldiers while also featuring French and possibly American allied soldiers, it can be assumed that we are either participating in the Second Battle of the Marne or the Meuse-Argonne offensive. However, straight off the bat we can notice a complete mess of nationalities, as we see that the Harlem Hellfighters, instead of wearing correct US M1912, M1917 or M1918 tunics, have reused British gear on, including the M1903 service uniform, M1908 webbing set and a British rain cape. This is quite a notable error considering that DICE chose this incorrect uniform to be worn by the Harlem Hellfighter on Battlefield 1's main cover, with him also being armed with a German Mauser C96 and MP18 for some reason. But hey, at least it is not as bad as the M1911 armed female soldier wearing a British P39 greatcoat, Afrika Korps boots, modern day cargo pants, American M7/M3 holster and M36 belt that featured on the Battlefield 5 cover. We briefly spot a German soldier wielding a British Webley Fosbury automatic revolver. The addition of the Luger P08 pistol would be a more appropriate choice here and throughout the rest of the game as well. This prologue also features French soldiers, but over their M15 horizontal blue greatcoat, they have World War II era German Y-straps and Imperial German belts and buckles, as well as Moss 36 pouches, which as the name would suggest was not introduced until 1936. The French soldiers are wielding British Enfield No. 1 Mark IIIs, which should be replaced by their standard rifle, the Lebel Model 1886. When we enter the gameplay, we see a British Mark V tank pass by us, and white soldiers wearing British uniforms who are retreating. Later on in the prologue, we go on to see and hear more of these soldiers, as well as play as a very distinctly British tank crew.
Use the M&G, sweep the ground!
However, their appearance here is incorrect, as the Harlem Hellfighters never fought alongside British soldiers in the same area during either of the battles that this game could be trying to depict here. It could be argued that these British uniform wearing white soldiers are supposed to be stand-ins for American forces, especially given that the US and UK troops have the exact same base British uniforms and webbing in this game's multiplayer. But this would also not make sense, as in that case they should obviously be wearing American uniforms. Furthermore, the Harlem Hellfighters were a segregated infantry regiment that was observed into French units when they entered the war, as the white American soldiers did not want to fight alongside them due to their ethnicity, meaning that they would not be fighting with the white US soldiers at all. Overall, the historically accurate solution for this is rather simple. Change every one of these white American or British troops into properly depicted French soldiers who the Harlem Hellfighters fought alongside in reality during these battles. These white soldiers, as well as the ones seen at the start of the subsequent tank sequence, can be seen equipped with Russian contract Winchester Model 1895 rifles as their main weapon. They are also painted in a white color, implying that they are possibly placeholders that DICE may have forgotten to change during the development process, but it is obviously inaccurate nonetheless. Our protagonist is armed with a Hotchkiss M1909 Bennett Merci, which was used by American forces during World War I. However, by 1918, they would likely be very few in numbers and should be replaced with the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, and French contracted Chauchat, or even the early M1918 BAR. The M1909's reloading animation for the non-empty reload is inaccurate, as the player character simply shoves the feeding strip as if nothing was retaining it in the first place. In addition, the third-person model shows the strip in a half-empty state, regardless of how many rounds have been fired or remain. Our character is also armed with a sidearm, being a strange M1911 hybrid, with features of both the M1911 and M1911A1 variants, the latter being anachronistic since the M1911A1 was not standardized until 1926. It also has a suspicious lack of an extractor modelled at the rear of the slide. All our Hellfighter protagonists in the prologue have British mill bomb grenades, which should be replaced by French Citron Fouque Model 1916 or F1 Model 1915 grenades. All of our playable Hellfighters are also equipped with Austrian 1910 shovels, which is also erroneously seen later used by a good few German soldiers as well. One of the weapons we can pick up from our allies is the Winchester M1907. This weapon did not see widespread use during World War I, with roughly 2,500 rifles being ordered by the French army. It is commonly used by the Hellfighters here as one of their primary weapons, which is incorrect as the AEF never issued these. In reality, when they arrived on the front, the Hellfighters were re-equipped with mostly French weapons and gear, while keeping their American uniforms. Examples of their weapons would include the French Berthier 1907/15, along with other older French rifles. Instead of having its usual 10-round mag, the M907 features a 20-round magazine, which was a catalogue offering for US police during the 1930s. Despite the game having a suitable US 1903 bayonet model already in the campaign on other weapons, all of the American M1907 and subsequent Springfield rifles have attached German S98 bayonets with sawback blades, while the German Gewehr 98 rifles have an incorrectly modelled KS98 bayonet on them, with a too short blade, missing sawback and lacking the more defined eagle's head shape at the base of the handle. All of the regular soldiers in the game lack any sort of rank insignia, meaning that they apparently all have the lowest rank of private. The MP18 is way too prevalent among the German forces throughout all the levels set in 1918. Estimates show that only about 4,000 of these ever actually saw combat during the second portion of this year. The loading lever of the MP18's 32-round Trommel magazine 08 should turn as the magazine depletes. In game though, the loading lever shakes while shooting but is otherwise static. The German soldiers throughout the campaign can be seen wearing the M1907 Feldrock tunic and 1907 Feldhosen trousers, as well as some being seen with M15 Feldmantel coats. The 1907 uniform would be fairly rare this late in the war, and the full M15 uniform should be more prevalent, not just the coat. The uniforms seen in game also both have incorrect piping, as the 1907 tunic should have no piping along the bottom of the skirt, and the M15 mantle should have no piping at all, as well as having a lighter green colour compared to the main colour of the body. Many of the Germans can still be seen wearing covered Pickelhaube spiked helmets with no regiment numbers in 1918. The same goes for the other two campaigns featuring the Imperial German Army during the late war period. The Pickelhaube should be fewer in numbers, or non-existent within this period, as the more protective M16 Stahlhelm would long be in service by now and mixed with some newer variants. If DICE wanted more variation for German headgear in the late war period, it should be some Stahlhelms with variations of turtle shell camo and cloth covers, along with enlisted field caps like the 1910 and 1917 versions. Some German models throughout the game also wear the Geda helmet or Geda skull cap, despite this helmet being a prototype that saw limited service back in 1915 and became obsolete after the introduction of the M16 Stahlhelm. Speaking of the Stahlhelm, the model shown in game is actually the Austro-Hungarian model 16 or 17, judging from the position of the chin strap rivets that are higher than the ones on the German models. Also, the chin strap itself appears to be a poorly modeled version of the standard leather chin strap used by the Austro-Hungarian army for all their steel helmets. The color of the helmet itself seems to be off too, as in game it's more of a silvery grey, when in reality it should be some shade of green for the German version. Some of the AI German soldiers are seen wearing the Sturmpanzer brow plate, an armoured attachment for the M16 Stahlhelm intended for use with sentries and snipers to give them extra protection. In game it can be seen being used by the AI assault class. We can also see that the Sturmpanzer is painted in the German turtle shell camouflage, which was a real wartime camo, but it was only applied to the helmet itself and never the brow plate. They have Swedish canteens as a rather terrible stand-in for their proper German 1907 canteen. A number of the Germans are wearing completely out of place leather US 1905 shotgun belts. The German models also wear the same World War II era white straps as their French soldiers, along with also anachronistic 1939 Marsch Stiefel boots. The in-game German flamethrower troopers are wearing a rare prototype smoke and fire rescue helmet with a slightly fictionalized hood. In reality, most flametroopers did not wear any mask. The flametroopers wear no additional armor, yet somehow take more shots to kill compared to regular enemy soldiers. Not to mention how the fuel tank explodes every time upon being shot, despite us using just regular bullets. We can even cause it to blow up by just hitting it with our shovel. To cause a tank to explode like this would be very difficult, requiring pure luck or special bullets to achieve in reality. As with most flamethrowers in film and video games, the Wechselapparat M1917 flamethrower, known more simply as the Vex, is depicted as being very short-ranged when it had a maximum firing range of up to 100 meters in reality. The Vex is also always seen operated by just one soldier. While this is technically possible, historically speaking, a squad of up to 6 would be assigned to help properly use it in most combat cases. When we switch perspectives to our second character of the prologue, we are armed with what the game and Battlefield Wiki calls the Heavy Machine Gun and Maxim MG respectively. However, its overall appearance looks more specifically based on the improved British variant known as the Vickers machine gun. One of the main differences between the British Vickers and other Maxim variants is the toggle lock system, for most of the Maxim variants will break downwards, while the Vickers will break upwards. Although when we inspect the AIs who use it in the other chapters like the Runner, we can see that the toggle lock system on the right side of the gun is not working. The MG's belt also disappears after firing. It should be pulled through the other side. And the bullet casing should also eject out of the bottom, not the side. Our position is then attacked by autocannon fire from a German R-class Zeppelin. This type of Zeppelin never even had autocannons, and would not be used for such low-flying attacks like this in broad daylight in the middle of a battlefield. Their primary function was higher altitude, long-range bombing runs, naval patrols, and reconnaissance, not frontline attacks. Also, the Pacific version of Zeppelin we see here is the one from the game's multiplayer, which is modelled on the famed Zeppelin L-30, aka LZ-62. However, the last recorded use of Zeppelin L-30 was in 1917, at the Estonian town of Pärnu, then part of Imperial Russia, where it was conducting a bombing raid and received serious damage that put it in repair for the rest of the war, meaning it physically could not be here in 1918 even if it wanted to. Ladies and gentlemen, may we represent to you a roundel of the Swedish Air Force, which was not even formed until 1926 on the middle of a German Zeppelin in 1918. We have come to the assumption that because this is so insanely inaccurate that it must be a troll or intentional Easter egg put in by a Swedish developer, but it is still obviously erroneous nevertheless. Upon leaving the MG, we pick up a Winchester M1897 shotgun in the famous trench gun configuration with rib sights. Rib sights were common civilian modifications used for hunting, therefore it would be unlikely to be on a military issue weapon. The brass shells we load into the shotguns lack the sawtooth crimp found in brass shells in this era. In line with classic video game logic, many of the shotguns have a pathetic range and damage output, in contrast to reality. When we are switching to the perspective of our tank gunner third character, it is mentioned that
new killing machines, like the tank, changed the shape of the war overnight. Luckily, they were mostly on our side. Mostly.
But this is the understatement of the century. The Imperial German army had only built 20 tanks, while the British built over 2,000, and the French around 4,000. These numbers also overwhelmed the amount of Beutepanzers, or captured allied tanks used by the Germans that later appear in the True Mud and Blood chapter, estimated to be approximately less than 300 used in reality. The insignia patches of the British troops indicate that they are from the 17th Northeastern Railway Pioneers Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers. They appear as the only British infantry, tank and artillery units featured in this entire game, even though in reality, they not only never participated in the battle with the Harlem Hellfighters, but also never retook Cambrai, held the Vosges region, nor participated in the Gallipoli campaign. Also note that these insignia patches appear on the uniform of the Harlem Hellfighters as well for some reason. Almost every British Mark V tank in the game has the identification number of D42, which in reality belonged to Daphne, a single Mark IV tank commanded by 2nd Lieutenant H.L. Sherwood, which was destroyed a year earlier on September 20th, 1917. Overall, there should be a larger variety of proper unit markings. Our allied tanks have aircraft roundels on them. Despite the tank being British and the crew having British accents, when the tank is destroyed we see a Hellfighter fly out of it. The model is likely a placeholder, but nevertheless, he should be replaced by at least a proper tank crew, or even better, a French tank crew with proper French tanks instead of British ones. It is also worth mentioning that the crews would likely be reduced to nothing more than a light mist if their tank suffered an ammunition explosion like this in reality, so how this guy is still intact afterwards does not make sense. For the near final sequence of the prologue, we start off equipped with what the game calls the Automatico M1918, but this gun and its features have many oddities. It is possibly based on the Italian Revelli Beretta Mod 1915, also commonly known by modern sources as the Beretta Model 1918, while the actual Beretta Mod 1918, later standardized into the Mod 1918/30, was supposed to be a different weapon that looked like this. The weapon in this game is depicted as having a near 1000 RPM, when the Relevi Beretta Mod 1915 was supposed to be semi-automatic only. One of our assumptions is that DICE possibly mistook the gun as its two-triggered prototype automatic variant known as the Machetto Automatico Savoia, and then made it full auto. In addition, the sights are in the wrong position, as they should be on the right side, not the left. But honestly, the more we look into the history of this mysterious Beretta Model 1918, along with its variants and related projects, the more we realize just how confusing and complicated their background and existences really are. One of our associates, Andri Silva 60, pointed out the possible existence of the automatic variant of the 1918, which is also the first example of its kind and looked very similar to the one in game. But in conclusion, our main assumption is that this might be a case of Ockman's razor. That is, the simplest solution is the correct one. In this case being that DICE decided to make it full auto and simply called it the Automatico M1918. Regardless, no matter how you slice it, the use of this mysterious Italian weapon and its variants during World War I is very controversial, and it did not see service on the Western Front, with the AEF also never having used any submachine guns in any capacity in reality. The gas mask we place on our face here is a British Mark IV General Service respirator, which did not see service until 1926. We also do not attach any of the clasps on the side and back of the respirator to the respirator bag. Moreover, we can see later on this soldier at the end of the prologue that it does not even have a tube or hose attaching it to the respirator bag either. The gas masks worn by the other Hellfighters appears to be, rather erroneously, the German 1917 Lederschutzmaske. The Springfield M1903 rifle has US Marine Corps iron sights that were only used during World War II. When our characters have a standoff in this cutscene, both armed with Gewehr 98s, we can see that their bayonets are somehow fixed to the stock of the Gewehrs instead of the bayonet lug just under the barrel. Plus, the bayonets themselves are actually US 1903 bayonets, when they should be German Seitengewehr bayonets. Among the scenes shown at the end of the prologue is one which includes a British soldier wearing German gear and equipped with a Vex flamethrower. By just so far looking at this game's around 12-minute long prologue, we are already at over 50 inaccuracies, an average of around 1 inaccuracy every 13 seconds played. But do you know where you wouldn't find this? Do you know a free-to-play game crafted by developers that genuinely care for both fun immersion and real attention to detail? A game with a fanbase so keen on historical accuracy that they have on multiple occasions leaked classified government documents to further improve the game's realism. I am not even joking, this has happened about a dozen times. Yes lads, the legendary War Thunder has sponsored this video. War Thunder is a free online game that lets you engage in epic and intense PvP vehicle battles with over 2,000 authentically created tanks, planes, helicopters and ships spanning across over 100 years of history from the 1920s to now. You can customize your vehicles with camouflages, historical markings, and even 3D decorations like bushes and equipment. Even the damage system is realistic, with the vehicles actually suffering damage to their parts and crew instead of just having generic hit points. By signing up with the channel's link below, you will receive huge exclusive bonuses, including premium tanks, a premium account, boosters, and much more. War Thunder is available on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, including older generations, all for completely free. So before finishing this video, click the link down in the description or pinned comment to download War Thunder today. Now, back to the inaccuracies. The game's first war story, Through Mud and Blood, places us as a British tank crew during the second battle for Cambrai. However, the battle is incorrectly stated as starting on October 17, 1918, when it actually begun on October 8. The game states that the Mark V was not a reliable tank, and throughout the story we go on to see parts of the vehicle breaking down a couple times. However, by 1918, the regular Mark V was fitted with a brand new 6-cylinder engine, which vastly improved the reliability, so much so that the engine would be used in many post-war British tanks. Such serious issues were likely to have occurred with the later Star Mark V variants instead. Our tank driver protagonist Edwards and engineer Finch are wearing different colours of the same generic overalls that do not match with the overalls worn by British tankers in reality. Plus, if we look close enough at the models, we can see that they have zippers on them, even though zippers did not start getting put on clothing until the 1920s. Edwards also wears a German M15 gas mask bag. Our tank commander Townsend, as well as other infantry officers present on the battlefield, are seen dressed like regular enlisted men and have no insignia or officer's uniform. We are not told what rank any of them have, and it isn't unheard of for officers to utilize EM uniforms, especially in direct combat, as to avoid extra enemy attention. So in this case it would be more so up to personal choice. However, what we certainly can count is how Townsend and Finch have rifle pouches on, with left side gunner McMahon even pulling out an SMLE Mark III rifle out of the tank in a later scene, all not matching up with the fact that tank crews would not be issued with rifles in reality because of the small interiors of the tanks. Finch's pouches are actually ones that seem to be based on a World War I Swedish or possibly a 1960s era Swiss design. These erroneous pouches also appear on the later seen German machine gunners. Bundles of German steel hand granata are seen as the only explosive attached to the British soldiers. This could be excused as just being a case of captured weaponry, as there was no real British equivalent explosive to them, but this same logic does not at all apply to the multitude of aforementioned out-of-place gear that reappears on the British models, including the US 1905 shotgun belt in leather and Austrian 1910 shovel, which is also again shown as our character's default melee weapon throughout the story. The German steel hand granata model is actually that of the post-war 1924 model that was later used in World War II. There should instead be much larger 1915, 1916 or 1917 models used during World War I, which featured a characteristic belt clip. Some of the British soldiers are wearing French M1892 holsters. The British can be seen using German MAS S16s. It should be replaced by British ones such as the BL 8-inch howitzer Mark I.
Come and meet Big Bess.
Black Bess was indeed an actual tank, however it was a Mark IV, not a Mark V, and it was captured by the Germans on December 1st, 1917, nearly a year before this war story takes place. Black Bess also features the incorrect unit marking of F71. The real tank did not feature this marking, and if it did, it should have an F nickname, not one with a B. There is also no recorded tanks bearing a marking of F71. The last tank with an F marking was a recovery tank with F63. There are also some slight creative liberties taken with Black Bess's paint scheme in game compared to the real tank as well. The conditions for the crewmen in tanks at the time were known to be miserable for several reasons, including heat and dirt, yet both our gunners, McManus and Pitchard, are for some reason wearing a variant of the Royal Flying Corps' flying coat, made from leather with a fur collar, designed to keep airmen warm while flying at high altitudes in unpressurized aircraft. I mean, where did they even get these coats from, and how on earth do they survive wearing such a thing inside of a World War I era tank? In reality, British tank crews generally wore proper headgear similar to infantry, but most of the crew in game don't have any helmets or peak caps. Instead, two of them wear cap comforters, while Edwards and McManus don't wear anything at all. All things considered, Black Bess is severely undermanned. A typical Mark V would need a crew of at least 6, with 8 being a typical requirement. In game, however, we start with 5 members, which is then reduced to just 3 after 2 of them perish later, yet we still operate the tank fine somehow. It is unknown how Black Bess can even fire both sponzons if only McManus is manning the guns and reloading them at this point. Among the Allied forces are quite a lot of ANZAC or Australian and New Zealand Army Corps soldiers. These troops could have been inspired by the New Zealand Division that participated in the southern sector during the Second Battle of Cambrai. However, at this point they should have stayed in the town of Quizcas-sur-les-Coups, which is located about 7 to 8 kilometers south of Cambrai since October 1st, 1918. Not Ribicourt as mentioned in the beginning of this chapter, which is based on the Ribicourt and Flishkay area, which is located around 10 to 11 kilometers southwest of Cambrai. Moreover, the New Zealand Division moved northeast from their original position during the Second Battle of Cambrai, not to the northwest towards the Bourlon Woods we reach in Mission 2. They, along with the Australian soldiers in the later The Runner Gallipoli war story, wear generic felt hats that aren't exactly the proper military-issued Australian slouch hats. Not to mention that the New Zealand troops also had their own unique lemon squeezer hat already. Despite ANZAC forces wearing these kinds of hats earlier in the war, they began to be phased away and replaced by more protective Brodie steel helmets in 1916. The machine gun wielding British soldiers are wearing rare and very out of place American Wilmer eye shields. British Vickers machine gun emplacements are often found among the German defences throughout this chapter. While a few here and there as captured weapons would be reasonable, they should be replaced by higher numbers of the standard German MG08. Some of these Vickers throughout the campaign are also attached to a pole that is possibly inspired by this particular field improvised anti-aircraft mounting pole. Nevertheless, the pole in game looks quite different from the real one, and most of the Vickers should generally be attached with their own tripod and monopod instead. Moreover, some of them are also mounted on a wheeled mount and attached with a gun shield that looks similar to the ones featured on the early version of the Russian Maxim, the PMM 1910, although some might argue that the Germans might have captured the guns from the Russian Expeditionary Force that did actually fight in the French sector. Using them in quite a huge number instead of proper German weapons still makes no sense, and it is very possible that this gun is just a British Vickers and DICE simply slapped Russian Maxim attachments onto it. It is worth mentioning that throughout the campaign, the Germans used the FK-96NA as the only kind of field gun available on the battlefield for them, and only the Mauser 16 in the case of heavier guns. However, in reality, the Germans used various kinds of field guns and artillery in the war. For example, the improved 7.7cm FK-16 for the mid to late war period, along with additional 10.5cm guns and even 15cm ones. The German field guns are all seen operated effectively by just one soldier. Normally the gun requires a crew of 5 to properly use in reality. A similar point can also be said for many of the single-handedly used machine guns featured in-game, which fail to include their allotted crews, not to mention how many of them are seen fired from the hip while moving for long periods of time, despite the weapon's sheer weight and recoil. When we use the FK-96NA field guns, we see that our character always inserts a shell that does not at all match with the look of the gun's actual 7.7cm shell. We can see throughout this story that every single one of the German FK96NAs, as well as the subsequent Renault FTs, feature much too brightly coloured patterns of what looks to be DICE's attempt to create Buntfarben Anstrich 1918 camouflage, with a slightly earthier toned but still off version featuring on all the upcoming A7Vs, captured Mark V tanks, and Pierce Arrow AA lorries. Most of them should have plainer colours and no camo, while the ones that do have them should be more directly based on actual German camos and have much more variation. For example, in the case of the A7V tank, there were numerous paint tests on them, likely almost one different camouflage per tank. The game depicts the A7V as a fairly common tank among the German army, with us encountering and destroying a total of 4 of them across the single day long time frame of this war story, in stark contrast to how they were extremely scarce, with only 20 of them having ever been built throughout the entire war in reality. Here we can clearly see Black Bess's MG firing at Germans with a gun that looks similar to the Lewis MG. However, the real MGs attached to the Mark V were Hotchkiss portative machine guns. Not to mention that the tank side and back MGs disappear during the gameplay for some reason. As a matter of fact, the only visible MG on the Mark V in the gameplay is an also incorrectly mounted Vickers MG in the front, which should again be a Hotchkiss Mark I instead. The type of wrench used by the British side, which we pick up from Finch here, is a German World War I service tool or spanner for German MG and or artillery. Despite the possibility of it being a captured one, the real one is smaller than the one in game. Not to mention how we can rather hilariously fix the entire tank with this tiny wrench within a way too short amount of time, but this is obviously for gameplay reasons. It is likely the case that the village we are attacking in this level is fictional, as it does not match with any in the Rebicore area. It is also worth mentioning that DICE loves to put several fictional locations among the objective capture points. For example, Buren's Crossing, which is a reference to a fictional character from Decimarlian, a 1977 published fantasy book written by a World War I veteran named J.R.R. Tolkien. Throughout this chapter, we encounter several French Renault FT tanks. Although the Germans did capture some Renault FTs, they only used them for testing purposes and not combat. Also, all the ones they captured were armed with MGs, not cannons. The larger usage of this kind of tank by the German forces would be more suitable for World War II. 3 of our tank crew members used the aforementioned Webley-Fowlsbury automatic revolver. Although it is not entirely wrong, this revolver was used during the Great War mostly by a few British officers who purchased it privately, meaning the far more common Webley Mark IV, 5 or 6 would be a more appropriate choice for them. Among the attacking Germans in this scene, and around the captured British Mark Vs later in Mission 3, are German tankers wearing the same generic overalls with anachronistic zippers as our British characters, but in a grey colour. They should look like this instead. They are also wearing quite misplaced British anti-splinter tank masks. Black Bess's messenger pigeon is white, which is typically quite rare to be seen in this part of Europe, as a traditional domestic pigeon is usually grey or brown. Although many pigeons were bred frequently for the war effort, it has been said that white pigeons have a shorter lifespan, if not taken care of properly. Its colour was likely chosen by DICE for its symbolic reasons, paired with the powerful scene we play with it, but nevertheless it makes no sense to be the only kind of pigeon that exists throughout the entire game, including the ones we subsequently find in the Arabian desert of the Nothing Is Written war story. The British artillery crews insert their own shells right into the German Mauser 16, which seems to be a fictional 9-inch howitzer shell based on the British 15-inch ones that already appear in-game as props. The width of the Mauser 16 barrel can contain 21cm shells, or around 8.3 inches long at a maximum, so this 9-inch shell should be too big for them. For the replacement, it should be captured 21cm shells used for the Mauser 10 and 16, or even better, proper British shells and artillery. Smoke is seen behind the artillery shells as they make their way through the air onto Black Bess. However, the British were using cordite, which is a smokeless propellant that replaced black powder and other propellants in the late 19th century. They could however be vapor trails, but this is unlikely due to the grey and black colour presented. The armor of World War I tanks were not that strong, just being thick enough to stop bullets, with the Mark V being prone to ammo explosions from HE concussion blasts shredding through the armor. Yet our tank in game not only survives dozens of hits from field guns and other tanks, but also from this direct 250-pound shell artillery bombardment, not to mention how the outside Germans somehow have no visible wounds from the blast either. Here Edwards pulls out a German C96 pistol out of the C96 broom handle holster he wears throughout the story. It is strongly indicated that Edwards is a fresh recruit.
Don't worry about me, sir. I'm ready to do my bit for king and country.
And our new driver, boys!
Meaning that he could not have captured it from the enemy. It is technically possible that it could have been bought by Edwards privately, but the popularity of this pistol, although did exist in Britain, was mostly apparent among officers, and really only before the onset of the war in 1914. In addition, the C96 model in-game does not have a hole in its safety lever, indicating that it is a wartime commercial model, thus even further discrediting this potential theory of it being produced or bought in the pre-war period. Realistically, Edwards should instead be armed with one of the aforementioned more common Webley revolvers. We can see that the Mauser C96 has a luminous night sight made from the hazardous radium compound. Despite this actually existing, there is no evidence of its usage for the Mauser C96. On a non-empty reload, the C96's bolt incorrectly slides back without any action from the player character. The bolt is also manually cocked even when a clip is used, but due to the use of the magazine follower alone to lock the bolt open, once a stripper clip is removed, the bolt should drop automatically. The game implies that we started from the Allied retaken Ribécourt and Flischke area at the beginning of the previous level, which was around 10 to 11 kilometers southwest of Cambrai. However, when we look at the compass, it shows that when starting from Ribécourt, we advance towards the northeast, then turn east and reach the Bourlon Woods here in Mission 2. However, the real Bourlon Wood area is located around 8 kilometers north of Ribécourt, not east. The troops that made a direct assault on the Bourlon areas were Canadian forces, not British or Anzac, and they had already captured the area on September 27, 1918, yes, before the Second Battle of Cambrai had even started. The presence of all direct Mark V tanks and Germans here makes no sense for this time period, as unlike the previous British forces during the First Battle of Cambrai in 1917, the Canadians didn't lose this sector to the German forces before or during this battle. Many of the Germans are now seen armed with the Selbstlader M16. It is believed that only about 500 to 1000 of these were ever produced, with the carbine version seen in game being released specifically for the aircraft and Zeppelin crews of the German Air Corps. They were also phased away by aircraft machine guns and remained sidelined until the end of the war, making its appearance among infantry, particularly in the late war period, virtually impossible. It is worth noting that there is a strong absence of other appropriate weapons among the Deutsches Heer soldiers throughout the campaign. Weapons such as the aforementioned regular PO8 Luger, the Eierhandgranate M1917, and Flakmine 17 that already exist in the game should make an appearance, together with newer ones such as a few Gewehr 98s with Graben Magazine, which is suitable for those in defensive positions and behind the lines, Karabiner 98 AZs, Gewehr 8805s, and or Karabiner 1888 should also be added to combat this lack of variation. Some 10,000 of the Austro-Hungarian Steyr M1912 were also known to have been issued to German units during the war as well. Among the German stockpiles is TNT with a detonator that is based on a World War II era American plunger, which also apparently works off wireless technology, since there is no fuse connecting the detonator to the dynamite, yet we still somehow explode them upon pressing the detonator. The American Remington Model 10A shotgun can be found among the German supplies. Around 3,500 of these were issued to US troops during World War I, so it could be argued that they are a rare case of captured weapons. But this argument does not hold as strong when considering that another American shotgun, the Browning Auto 5, referred to as the 12G automatic in-game, is also seen not only among their crates, but also combat used by the Germans. This is quite ironic to see, considering that in September of 1918, the German government issued a formal diplomatic protest against the use of shotguns in wartime, alleging that it violated the Hague Convention of the use of cruel and inhumane weapons. The Browning Auto 5 has a ribbed barrel. In reality, the ribbed barrel would interfere with the operation of the Auto 5 due to its reciprocating barrel. When reloading the Browning Auto 5, our character inserts shells without holding down the bolt release. In the mid-1950s, a two-piece shell carrier design was incorporated, making this possible. But this Auto 5 should not be able to do this given the World War I time period. The confusing Italian Beretta SMG prototype that we mentioned earlier appears now again in German crates. There is barely any evidence of this weapon being used by the Italians themselves during this time, so it is safe to assume that it would not have seen service outside of the Italian theatre. To be honest, any submachine gun in the Western Front theatre, other than the MP18 that was used during the very late war, should be non-existent. Throughout the story, we can pick up a Mauser C96, M1903 Springfield, and an M1911 with Maxim silencers attached. While these particular examples did exist, silencers were created for hearing protection on the civilian market. In addition, their firing sounds are a bit too quiet, which is likely for the gameplay, but it is still obviously very questionable to see American M1903s and M1911s with such rare components among German weapon crates behind enemy lines. Here we find the Stansuchen Hellrieger 1915, an incredibly obscure prototype heavy submachine gun. No examples survived the war, and there are only 3 photographs that show it even ever existed. DICE had to assume many of its aspects, such as completely making up the appearance of its left side, because no one knows what that side of the weapon even looked like, because all 3 of its pictures only show its right side. The weapon never went beyond an initial firing trial and was never adopted by any military faction, making its appearance among these crates extremely ludicrous. The 60-round detachable drum magazine depicted in-game is completely fictional. The weapon was known to feed either from a straight box magazine estimated to have a capacity of around 20 rounds, or from a drum magazine with an estimated capacity of around 160 rounds that is noticeably larger than the one in-game. The Mauser 1917 carbine is found throughout the campaign, despite only 40 of the prototype and trial versions ever being produced in real life, and not being adopted by any military. The Mauser 1917 carbine, as well as the later seen Mondragoon rifle, are found attached with the patrol scope, which seems to just be the British Lee Enfield Periscope Prism Company scope, with the front and rear ends removed, in a possible attempt to recreate the Aldis scope, but this was also used by the British faction, so is misplaced regardless. Moreover, the scope uses the fine cross reticle and stadia lines, instead of the appropriate British T-pose one. Oddly, the weapon has a 20-round fixed magazine. While these did exist, they weren't ever recorded as being put into carbines. Despite being a carbine, it inflicts identical damage to the regular C96 and only has a slightly higher muzzle velocity. It, along with many of the other game's weapons' aperture sights, have been enlarged for gameplay purposes. The optical variant of all the game's weapons are attached with a rare British Gibbs magnifying lens sight designed for the Lee Enfield. For whatever reason, some of the different variants for the same weapons don't share ammo compatibility with one another. Although some weapons require different magazines for the same caliber, this is definitely not the case for other weapons. For example, the regular Selbstlader M1916 and the optical Selbstlader M1916 do not share ammo, despite literally being the same weapon, with the only differences being in the attached sight and foregrip. Despite going through several test trials, the Canadian Huat automatic rifle we find here was ultimately rejected from entering service after the war was over, and only 5 of them were ever built, so their existence among these weapon crates throughout the campaign is utterly absurd. The Huat is portrayed as functioning as a closed bolt system and tracks +1 in the chamber. In reality, it functions in open bolt form. Among the crates, we find what the game refers to as the FRG grenade launcher, which is just an American Winchester Model 1907 rifle with a German Mauser Cup type grenade launcher attached. Apart from the fact that the base gun was unlikely to be used by the Germans, we can't find any photos or info to suggest the existence of this weird combination at all. Here we find a 4-barreled British Lanchester Houda pistol. Only 712 of these were ever produced, and it is highly doubtful that such an outdated 19th century weapon would be lying around German stockpiles, since it would have to have been captured from the extremely limited amount of British soldiers who used it on the World War I battlefield in a time where more reliable and modern Webley revolvers were far more prevalent. The ammunition we load into it appears to be .455 Webley Mark VI rounds, which were only introduced in 1939. In addition, it seems as though the bullets were referenced from blank inert rounds, plus they have strike marks on their primers indicating that they already have been fired. Despite being loaded with regular handgun cartridges, when we fire, the bullets spread as if they were shotgun shells. Although the Lancaster pistol was able to fire .410 shotgun shells, it was rather impractical due to the sheer recoil and weight of the shells being put into such a small-sized weapon. The MG15NA's appearance in the game is a weird combination between the older AA and newer NA versions. Also, the MG15NA is seen used as the only LMG for the Germans. Just about 5,000 of these were ever manufactured, and they were used primarily on the Eastern and Middle Eastern fronts. Most of them should be replaced with the MG0815, which was their main LMG since the end of 1916. The German support class soldier model appears, wearing an out-of-place Italian mess kit and a rucksack from the Italian 1907 backpack set. Instead of there being any other type of German artillery shells nearby at all, throughout the campaign, oftentimes very close to the German guns, we can find British 3.3-inch shrapnel rounds for QF 18-pounder guns, and the aforementioned 15-inch howitzer shells for BL 15-inch howitzer. The problem is that these rounds are way too large for both the 7.7cm FK96NA and the 21cm MAS S16s that the Germans have in the game. Moreover, the 15-inch howitzer rounds are seen in multiple different sizes, most of them being way smaller than their real-life counterpart. They even have 15-inch written on them, even when they would obviously not fit this caliber at this miniaturized scale. The 15-inch howitzer round in reality was so heavy in fact, that it needed to be lifted up by cranes. Additionally, only 12 of the BL 15-inch howitzers were ever built, and only 10 of them made it to France, making its shell's high presence throughout the game rather ludicrous. Some of the British 18-pounder high explosive or HE shells also make their appearance in fewer numbers. Apart from the same problems like the shrapnel rounds counterpart we had mentioned, its overall appearance looks very identical to the post-war version that was used in the World War II period. We can see a fuse on top of the HE rounds, which is just a direct copy from the shrapnel rounds model, which seems to be the time and precaution fuse N80. However, for HE rounds it should be either N100 or N101 precaution fuses instead. The German crates contain what the game calls the AT rocket gun, which is actually a British 1.59-inch breech-loading Vickers QF gun Mark II. This weapon was declined by both the Army and later Royal Flying Corps in 1917, and its remaining prototypes were eventually scrapped. Within the German supplies, we locate a Madsen LMG, which is anachronistically modelled on the post-war Portuguese contract model, which bears several features that were not present on any wartime Madsens, including a double-stacked magazine and a flash hider. They are all also attached with an anti-aircraft spider sight that is possibly based on the Madsen tripod in AA configuration, likely to be used by the Argentine military also in the post-World War I eras. Among some of the crates, we find British Lewis LMGs attached with a German ZF-12 telegraphic machine gun sight for the MG08. Instead of using a correct reticle, similar to the one used on a glass visor 16 bifocal scope, it uses the fine crossed one with stadia lines once again. In an effort to prevent the scope attachment from blocking the magazine, the developers have made it so that all weapon scopes have been side mounted, even when real examples of the weapons had centrally mounted scopes, such as what should be the case with the Gewehr 98 here. Also, instead of using proper German scopes with their own reticles, the scopes attached to the Gewehr 98 turns out to be a now fully modelled version of the aforementioned British Periscope Prison Company scope with the short cone ocular housing variant, which also has a fine crossed reticle and stadia lines instead of using the more appropriate British T-post reticle. The limpet charge found in this German crate is based on the British MD-17A Mark I limpet mine from World War II, thus is anachronistic for this game. The limpet charge sticks to all surfaces regardless of their material. Although likely a gameplay decision, the actual limpet mines are magnetically attached. It also is shown as detonating based on a standardized timer, when the actual design had a detonation system based on a water-soluble pellet, which wouldn't allow for it to detonate in open air. Among the German crates is, rather erroneously, the Italian Sea Regatti rifle, which although was tested by several countries, was never actually adopted by any military force, with only about 257 of them ever being made. The armoured cars being used by the Germans are actually British Pierce Arrow AA lorries with a removed anti-aircraft gun. Only 48 of these lorries ever existed during the war, and there are no records of any of them being captured. The game calls the Renault FT the FT-17, which is the name used in post-World War I literature. We can use this Renault FT, however it turns out that we alone can drive and shoot its guns at the same time, despite the vehicle needing 2 crew members, a driver and a gunner, to operate it in reality.
Well, that's enough fun and games for a Tuesday.
The date when this chapter is set, October 17th, was a Thursday, not a Tuesday. At the start of the next level, Black Bess breaks down again. However, the sudden breakage with the engine would not result in the tank suddenly being forced to a halt. It would continue to roll until Edwards put on the handbrake, or the tank would eventually come to a stop.
And what about our tanks? Can you see any of our tanks down there?
Edwards? Yeah. But they're not ours anymore.
The Germans never actually used captured Mark V tanks, although older ones like the Mark IV tanks were relatively few, with only about 40 of them being used. According to both objectives in Mission 4 and the Battlefield Wiki, the village we arrive at here is Bourlon, which is further suggested by a train station area in Mission 4 named the Bourlon Rail Yard. However, the real village of Bourlon was heavily damaged by the fighting throughout the war, making the overall portrayal of the village in-game inaccurate. Not to mention that the Bourlon village has a complete absence of its church and chateau, combined with an inaccurate presence of quite a lot of windmills around the village that cannot be found anywhere in historical photographs, and the layout of the village doesn't match with real map plans either. Although the British forces were able to retake the Bourlon areas for a brief moment during the First Battle of Cambrai towards the end of November 1917, they lost it to the German counter-attacking forces not long after, and the battle was ended on December 7, 1917. Thus, the existence of these very new-looking French propaganda posters in the village that was captured by Germans for a couple of years and was retook by the British forces only for a brief moment is questionable. They would likely have been taken down, replaced with German ones, or simply would have worn away over time or gotten destroyed in the combat. Among the German crates is a marksman version of the British SMLE rifle, which is fitted with the American Warner and Swansea M1913 musket sight. Although the British faction did use several kinds of long-range scopes so that they would be able to compete with the German counterparts before eventually adopting their own scopes during the late war, there is no evidence of this musket sight attached on the SMLE rifles. During World War I, apart from the M1903 Springfield, there's a report of its usage on the Canadian Ross rifle, but that's about it. Moreover, for some reason, the Swayze scope's reticle on both the SMLE and Springfield are not the fine scope reticle with 3 statia lines, as in reality. Instead, DICE gave a possible variation of German-styled reticles for the M1903 Springfield, and gave what looks similar to the one featured in the German Glasvisor 16 bifocal scope for the SMLE rifle. The marksman version of the SMLE rifle is also attached with what looks to resemble the Stevens Pope/Schutzen palm rest. There are no reports or photo evidence of its existence on this particular rifle. When reloading, the striker of the SMLE incorrectly moves back when pulling the bolt back at the start of a reload. Among the crates and in the hands of all the German tankers is a strange hybrid of the rare Luger carbine and the Luger LP08 artillery. The German crates contained the Mexican Mondragoon rifle, which was briefly trial tested by the German army, but were found to be too unreliable in trench conditions and unsuitable for infantry use. They were instead adopted by the Imperial German Flying Corps in 1915 as the FISK-15. However, they were limited in numbers and began to be phased out of service and handed off to the Navy after aircraft machine guns equipped with synchronization gear became available in mid-1915, overall making its appearance among German infantry supplies in the late war period quite inaccurate. In addition, the Germans issued the weapon with 30-round drum magazines, whereas in-game the weapon is only found with a 10-round mag. It is also questionable to why it has such a terribly pitiful damage output when we consider that the gun needed high quality ammunition to function properly in reality. We can find a horse here which, despite being found within enemy territory, has a number of allied gear on, including the British Mark 6 water bottle, leather equipment pouch, and 1903 SMLE bandolier and French M1892 holster. When we ride the horse, our character is always seen equipping a British pattern 1796 light cavalry sabre and Russian contract Winchester model 1895 rifle from the saddle's gun holster. Since this horse seems to belong to the Germans, it should be equipped with German gear, sabre, and a proper German pistol or carbine instead. During Mission 4, we approach Bourlon Rail Yard. According to the actual map, there was a small train station located in the northeast of the village. However, it is portrayed in-game as located in the southeast and being a large complex with several buildings surrounding it. In the distance we can see Cambrai, which the compass shows is located to the southeast of the Bourlon area. However, the real Cambrai was located further to the east, while the Bourlon Woods would be located close by to the southeast of the village instead. The general look and layout of the town of Cambrai is very off, with many of its landmarks being missing. The town was smaller at this time than it is today, and it did not have many of these buildings. We also see that there is a river depicted between Bourlon and Cambrai that simply does not exist here in reality. When on the approach to Cambrai, the crew will sing one of three songs. It's a Long Way to Tipperary, Pack Up Your Troubles, or Show Me the Way to Go Home. The last song of these three was not written until 1925. Among the German soldiers charging at the tank here is one that has a Vex flamethrower but is wielding an MP18 submachine gun instead of the Vex's hose. Flamethrower operators would not even have been issued such a bullet firearm in reality. Another one of the Deutsches Heer soldiers is also seen wearing a British 1908 small pack along with a pair of British leather equipment pouches too. Our next war story, Friends in High Places, takes us to the Vosges region of France in the spring of 1917, where we play as an American pilot among the British Royal Flying Corps. Before covering this story, it is important to put a slight disclaimer that it is heavily implied that our protagonist, Clyde Blackburn, is an unreliable narrator, and some parts of his story may be fiction.
And that's my story. Things get mixed up in wartime though, and you'll probably hear other versions. But don't listen to any of that. What you heard from me is the truth. I wouldn't tell you if it wasn't. Would I?
Nevertheless, we will continue to analyze this story as to point out any inconsistencies in order to expose these lies, like how historians usually do to uncover the truth from all the myths and legends that emerge from the wartime and other such historical events. This point might bring to mind the old rumor that this game is set in an alternate reality. However, there are articles and interviews from DICE, including the ones shown on screen now, that directly disprove this, and regardless, even if it was created with the intention of being based on an alternate universe, it would not really matter, because as we have to make clear, the point of this whole series is simply to use the game's presented content as a tool to educate, entertain, and perhaps even provide the research groundwork for potential future remakes or historical rework mods. Before we even fully load into the missions of this chapter, we see that our character's Royal Flying Corps Bristol F2 fighter on the cover has Italian Military Aviation Corps roundels and tail colours. Before 1918, the Vosges region was defended by the French forces until the arrival of American reinforcements afterwards. Not the Royal Flying Corps and British infantry that are the only allied force we see throughout this story. The roundels featured on the British aircraft, which we also saw on some of the Mark V tanks earlier, is a post-World War I Royal Air Force one. The period Royal Flying Corps roundel had a smaller red circle and featured a white outline for planes with camouflage. Our Bristol BF2 has the registration number of A1257, which belonged to a Navy contracted Curtis J.N. Jenny trainer aircraft in reality. Instead of wearing any appropriate variation of a Royal Flying Corps officer uniform, RFC officer George Rackham is wearing a terribly represented one, consisting of a non-British generic military officer's tunic, with no rank insignia of course, and also pretty generic shirt and tie, in addition to an Imperial German belt and brown retextured German pants and World War II jackboots again. Wilson is wearing a fictionalized RFC jacket when he should most likely have a long leather trench coat instead. A shortened version did exist, but it didn't look like the version in the game. That being said, pilots were given quite a lot of freedom, so it is not impossible to suggest that he might be using his own civilian bought one, but the game tries to depict this jacket as standard issue, with us seeing it worn by multiple other British airmen later, which is inaccurate. Our character Blackburn is wearing a German pilot jacket. The location in this first level looks more like the Alps than the Vosges. The real Vosges is a much older mountain range, meaning lower and less steep mountains. Not to mention that this mission is supposed to be set in spring, meaning there should not be this much snow. The German Fokker DR-1 is anachronistic since it did not have its first flight until June of 1917 and did not see widespread use until 1918, especially given that since only 320 of them were ever built, it makes no sense to see the entire German Luftstreifkräfte use this kind of fighter in all the battle sequences as its main fighter in this setting. A better era-accurate candidate to replace this aircraft would be the Albatros D3. Every German Fokker DR-1 is seen having a red color scheme. This is most likely a reference to Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who famously did paint his triplane in a red color. However, this was not at all the case for every German fighter. There should be much more variation between their paint colors. A variant of the Balkenkreuz insignia continues to feature on the German vehicles, despite it being an emblem not introduced until 1918. The curvier Iron Cross puttee ones would be more suitable for this 1917 time setting. With the exception of their headgear, all of the pilots and other airmen in the game, regardless of nationality, wear just retextured versions of the clothes worn by the British pilot models. Wilson captures the Germans committing an inaccuracy in 4K, that being them using a couple of British 9.2-inch Mark I siege howitzers, not to mention the absolutely comedically large amounts of the aforementioned rare British BL 15-inch howitzer shells seen around them and all over the place. Multiple British Sopwith Camel fighters appear as anachronisms, since they were introduced in June of 1917, not spring. A more era-correct Sopwith aircraft would be the Sopwith Pup. In contrast to what is depicted in this next level, there weren't any major attacks on the Vosges sector in 1917. The only German fortress in the region is Forte Mutzig, located close to the then German border, which never saw any significant attacks by the Allies throughout the entire war. Also, when compared with real maps, photos and historical artworks, the whole fortress complex and surrounding areas in-game look very different from the actual Forte Mutzig. The Germans are again seen utilizing many rare British Pierce Arrow armoured AA lorries, but with them now being incorrectly armed with British QF 1-pounder pom-pom AA guns, rather than the lorry's actually mounted QF 2-pounder AA gun. According to the compass, every Royal Flying Corps aircraft is heading from east to west. This would mean that they somehow managed to fly and take a long detour across the enemy positions without being detected or damaged by AA guns or intercepted by fighters earlier. To make the matter worse, these German fortifications and trenches below are seen facing directly towards the east instead of the southwest or south where the Allied front line should be located. The observation posts attached to these barrage balloons have a British Vickers MGs on every one of them. The information and photos we gathered point out that MG crews instead defended the balloons from the ground. It is possible that DICE might have mistaken a long-range camera used by the Germans with a machine gun, as we can see in this picture. Although they are serving as just low poly field dressings in this scenario, we can still clearly make out that the defending soldiers in the German trenches below us are copy and pasted British models, with their Brodie helmets and Mark IV respirators. The British faction can be seen using the Italian Caproni CA-5 as their main bomber. This is both anachronistic and misplaced, since this aircraft's first flight was not until late 1917, and there is no record of its usage among the Royal Flying Corps. The Handley Page Type 0100 would be a better choice for replacement. The Caproni bombers are seen having British Vickers machine guns, rather than the Italian Fiat Ravelli machine guns that they were armed with in reality. It could be argued that the Brits in this scenario replaced them out with their own MGs, but this theory does not stand for when we still see the Vickers MGs on the Italian-used Caproni bombers in the upcoming Avanti Savoia chapter. When we wake up after crashing in the following level, we see that our character bailed out with a parachute. Although they did exist during this time, Royal Flying Corps pilots were not issued parachutes due to them not fitting easily in the cockpit, as well as weight issues. There was also an assumption that parachutes might be seen as an easy escape route for the pilots if they ran into technical difficulties. Despite this mission still being set in the Vosges region, the sharp mountainous peaks are now completely gone and have been replaced with very flat land. Although not as dramatic as the mountains seen at the start of the story, the Vosges is still well known for its mountainous areas with a lot of steep terrain. Even if this mission is supposed to be taking place in the plains below, we should still be able to see mountains in the distance at least. The Webley Fosbury automatic revolver that we are armed with is incorrectly referred to in the game as the automatic revolver .38. This cartridge version of the revolver did exist, but it is clear that the game's model is based on the .455 British service variant, as the .38 version had an 8-round cylinder, not a 6-round one. The appearance of the 1917 gas mask can on the German models is now anachronistic, since it was not introduced until late 1917, not early in the year. As the MP-18 never reached the front until the latter half of 1918, its high appearance among the Germans in this story's 1917 year setting is now completely anachronistic. We can find the Germans having a number of Austro-Hungarian weapons and equipment, including loads of the aforementioned Austrian 1910 shovels, the M1895 rifle, a hatchet which appears to be based on this likely to be civilian-made Austro-Hungarian one, and a pickaxe which, although does have similar looking German designs, overall seems more like it was modelled on this Austro-Hungarian one known as the Bell Picka. The appearance of these items among the Germans in the previous chapter was a bit more acceptable, as there were actually a few Austro-Hungarian infantry divisions that were present and collaborated with the Germans in France since July of 1918. However, for this story's 1917 setting, other than a few Austro-Hungarian artillery units that appeared on the Western Front since 1914, there were no notably sized units of this faction here in France that could explain this much of their weapons and equipment being present among the Germans at this stage. These field hospitals or medical tents throughout the campaign are very likely to be based on the World War II versions, particularly the US ones, while those in World War I looked quite different, many of them being fully enclosed tents as shown in historical photographs. It is also worth mentioning the complete lack of corpsmen, field medics, and Red Cross personnel, especially nurses, throughout the campaign. Even when wounded personnel are present, these tents usually feature the Red Cross symbol, which had volunteers everywhere in the actual war. We can overhear German soldiers talking about the 1918 influenza, aka the Spanish flu, which is a common misnomer to call it nowadays.
Warum sind die Männer wieder hier? Wir sollen in Quarantäne sein. Das ist doch nur eine Grippe. Ich habe das im Fronturlaub in der spanischen Zeitung gelesen. An dieser Grippe sterben Tausende von Menschen.
In reality, no one knows exactly where the disease came from, and it never became news until the discovery of the flu was openly reported by Spain within May and June of 1918. Very anachronistic for the spring 1917 setting of this story. Some of the Germans are also heard talking about the Harlem Hellfighters.
Das mit den Harlem Hellfighters. Sind die in unserem Sektor?
Nein.
Gott sei Dank.
Das Oberkommando spielt das Thema runter. Aber ich habe einen Freund, der im Hauptquartier arbeitet. Und der sagt, es gibt ernste Bedenken, weil einer unserer Frontabschnitte wegen...
This makes no sense at all, since the Hellfighters were shipped to Europe on December 27, 1917, and later joined the battle alongside the French in April 1918. It'd make more sense if both conversations occurred in the previous Through Mud and Blood chapter, but not here. In the beginning of this next mission, we can see one of the British Navy's Iron Duke class dreadnought battleships near the Palace of Westminster in London. As of spring 1917, however, none of these were present in London. Instead, all the ships of the Iron Duke class battleships were still in the North Sea during 1917 and 1918, as were most of the British capital ships due to the imposing dangers of the German high seas fleet. Also, it makes zero sense to how on earth this ship even managed to get past the several bridges across the Thames River to park nearby the Westminster Bridge in the first place. Even back in 1917, the only bridge that a ship like this could be able to pass would be the iconic Tower Bridge that was able to fold its ramps up. Our assumption is that the ship could possibly be inspired by the modern-day HMS Belfast, which has been moored as a museum ship on the River Thames in London, but this isn't even parked near the Parliament buildings. On the ship, we again see officers wearing their caps with regular infantry uniforms. Since they are in London, the aforementioned blending in to avoid enemy attention on the front lines logic does not stand here. There are also no Navy personnel seen on the ship at all. This could be forgivable though, as most of them would likely be on leave, but it is still worth mentioning anyway. A large German air raid is depicted arriving over London. However, this does not match with the spring 1917 time setting of the story, since the first daytime bombing of London did not occur until the summer months. What we see in game is likely to be inspired by the Gotha raids, either the June 13th or July 7th attacks as part of Germany's Operation Turkenkreuz. Also, not only is the time setting off, but the betrayal is also greatly exaggerated in game, as in reality the Germans received few casualties in both attacks, and there were not dozens of different German planes involved, as in both attacks all of them consisted of Gotha bombers only. The German Fokker D-1 fighter only had a 300km range. For them all to get here, they would have had to take off from Belgian air bases, then manage to fly across the North Sea or Strait of Dover into England, and then to London. At this distance of travel, they would not have enough fuel to fly home, making it safe to assume that they are rather inaccurately conducting a one-way trip kind of mission here. That is nothing but a worthless operation that would only achieve unnecessary wasting of their pilots and planes. The Gotha planes used during daylight bombing raids over London are known to have been painted solely, or at least mostly, in a white colour, while the lozenge camo variants we see in game were quite unlikely to be used during the raids. Instead of having their actual mounted Parabellum LMG-14s, the Gotha bombers in the gameplay are all seen armed with British Vickers MGs. Two of the exact same model of Zeppelin, being the L-30, joined the fight, with additional third and fourth one showing up later. Contrary to what the game depicts, there was only one L-30 Zeppelin, and it was not present or completely destroyed over London. As a matter of fact, even if these clones are meant to represent the other airships among the Zeppelin or class, it would still not match up, as there should not be any Zeppelin operations occurring at all at this time. After the operations in October 1916, the closest Zeppelin operation to the game's time setting would be a nighttime one that occurred on October 19, 1917, known as the Silent Raid. So obviously the wrong time of day and year, since the real one happened during an autumn night, not spring day. We can spot German Halberstadt CL-2 planes. Not only again should they not really be here due to their limited range, but they are also quite anachronistic to appear, as they did not enter service until August of 1917, well after spring. During their actual missions, Zeppelin crews were known to wear much warmer clothes and specific gear due to the near freezing temperatures they had to endure from the altitude. These included leather overalls, 4 overcoats, leather helmets, gloves of leather, and wool boots covered by large felt overshoes and scarves and goggles. In the game, although we do see a few of them wearing a black recolored version of the British RFC jacket with a large fur collar, the rest of the crew members are wearing the game's version of standard army uniforms with regular helmets. To further add to this, they should not be typical army personnel. Although Zeppelins designated to the German army indeed existed, the L-30 Zeppelin that this one is modeled on belonged to the German Navy. Thus their uniforms, headgear and insignias should be much different to correspond to this. As seen in historical pictures, even if it was an army Zeppelin, they would still have vastly different uniforms than what we see in game. A number of the Zeppelin crew members are seen armed with the anachronistic MP-18 as well as the American Browning Auto 5 shotgun. Historical photos and sources show that at this point they are unlikely to be armed with such small arms fire and would likely be too busy manning their machine guns or piloting the vessel rather than acting as security personnel. If they were to be given guns, then the weapons supplied to the German Air Force crews, including, ironically enough, the aforementioned Selbstlader M1916 and regular Mondragoon, would be a more reasonable choice. On top of the Zeppelin is a British Maxim Nordenfeld QF 1-pounder pom-pom. During World War I, Germany did actually use an anti-aircraft gun version of this weapon known as the Maxim Flak M14. However, they were not put on any Zeppelins. Although there are sources showing that German airmen wore high-altitude oxygen masks, the wearing of gas masks on Zeppelins is unlikely. Also, the specific model worn by this German is the 1917 Lederschutzmaske, which, just like with its aforementioned corresponding K-Nyne, did not enter service until later in that year. The following war story, Avanti Savoia, takes place in Dolomites, northern Italy in the fall of 1918 and sees us play as an Italian RDT shock trooper. We can straight away notice, however, that the level's introduction wrongfully refers to the Austro-Hungarian Empire as just Austro-Hungaria. For some reason, our protagonist Luca, his brother Matteo, and several other Italian soldiers wear ribbon bars on their uniforms directly into battle, and one of the ribbon bars is even anachronistic, as it is the World War I Victory Medal ribbon bar, not instituted until December of 1920. Luca and the fellow RDT he fights with lack their distinctive uniforms and insignia and are instead just wearing regular Italian infantry 1909 uniforms with 1907 Carcano pouches. The Italians wear much of the aforementioned Allied gear in a very out of place and lazy example of reused assets. These include the British Mark VI water bottle and 1907 bayonet with E-tool handle, French M1892 holster, US 1905 shotgun belt in leather, and the what looks to be Swedish or Swiss ammo pouches. In DICE's attempt to make the Italians look cooler, they gave many of them bersaglieri capes or cloaks. These were pretty much only worn by mountaineers, particularly some officers here and there behind the front lines, but not by RDT or infantry in combat, especially in such large numbers. Way too many of our allies are seen wearing the very rare and experimental Donard visor. Throughout this story, Matteo's unit, which is implied to be a standard infantry one, is said and shown to be directly attacking the main enemy target, being the fort, while our RDT forces are shown flanking around the fort and acting in a supportive role to them.
My brother's battalion had been ordered to capture a fort deep into enemy territory. I wasn't going with him. I was part of a special unit with a different mission. Our task was to support Matteo's battalion. We were a proud unit. We changed the war for Italy. The RDT.
However, in reality, these roles should pretty much be the other way around. Since the RDT were the shock troopers, their task was to quickly assault, overwhelm and neutralize the enemy defenses for the infantry to then move up and support them afterwards. Luca puts on very stylized and inaccurate Farina armor. It consists of German lobster armor and arm protection from an experimental US armor design. And while the model of helmet is correct, it has a visor which the real version never had. Actual Farina armor was a lot lighter and more basic as seen in historical photographs. When we enter the gameplay, we see that we are more or less of an unstoppable juggernaut while wearing it. In reality, this type of armor was cumbersome and heavy, could only protect against bullets fired from more than 125 meters or so away, and did not give protection from grenades, making it more so of a burden than a useful asset, as it limited movement and reduced visibility. Overall, although this example depicts incorrect American Brewster armor, the wearing of this much Farina armor we see in game would more closely resemble this scene from the film many wars ago. We start this mission armed with a German MG08-15 machine gun, which the Italian army never adopted. One could argue that it is a captured weapon, but regardless, the RDT unit in particular were instead usually more lightly armed, with close quarter weapons such as pistols, melee weapons and hand grenades, along with the occasional use of rifles or carbines and other sorts of weapons in supporting cases. In addition, this MG08 features an ahistorical chainsaw type grip mounted on the barrel that resembles the carrying handle of the British Lewis gun. The weapon is reloaded with disintegrating belts. Though a disintegrating belt did exist for the MG08 during World War I, it was not standard. The reload animation itself is rather inappropriate too, as it simply shows us pushing a magazine into the MG08 and seemingly not putting enough work in pulling the belt into the action. Many of the aforementioned incorrect explosives return in this setting. By default, our character spawns in equipped with British mill bomb grenades, dynamite with the World War II American plunger, and bundles of anachronistic German Stielhandgranate. Later on in mission 2, we see Italian corpses also have light grey or white coloured Stielhandgranate on them for some reason, while regular model Stielhandgranates also appear attached to and in the crates of the Austro-Hungarian forces alongside World War II British naval limpet mines. Overall, the Italians should be armed with their own grenades, such as the SIPE, while the Austro-Hungarians should have Austrian-made ones like the Ruhr hand grenade. Recommendations for replacements of the other explosives could include a few Bengalia rifle grenades attached to appropriate rifles for the Italians, as well as Zeitzunder Gewehrgranate variants for the Austro-Hungarians. Our fellow Italian forces are also shown armed with many other incorrect earlier mentioned weapons, including the Beretta SMG prototype and rare C. Regati rifle, in addition to the misplaced American Auto 5 shotgun, Russian contract Winchester Model 1895, and large amounts of French M1909 Bennett Mercies. Instead, they should be armed with weapons such as the Carcano M1891 as their standard issue rifle, along with pistols especially for the RDT, such as the Bodio Model 1889, along with some of the notorious Gilsenti Model 1910s, and for machine guns, the Fiat Ravelli Modello 1914 should appear as their standard. The C. Regati and Russian contract Winchester rifles are now seen attached with out-of-place US 1903 bayonets. The Italian forces are seen using only German FK96NA field guns. They should instead be using Italian standard field guns, like the Canona de 7527 Modello 06, while the ones found among the Austro-Hungarians should be field guns like the 8cm Feldkanone M5. The soldiers using the field guns also apparently insert the same incorrect ammo shells used by our protagonists that don't even match with the ones in the crates that they are picking them up from, which turn out to be reused assets of the British 3.3-inch rounds, which are again a too large caliber of shell to even fit in the FK96NA. Also note that these British shells appear in the Austro-Hungarian bunkers too. Behind the field guns are a number of unbuilt British 9.2-inch Mark I siege howitzers, which also never saw use by the Royal Italian Army in reality. The Italian Mortaio de 210-8 howitzer would be a suitable replacement. This war story supposedly takes place during the Third Battle of Montegrappa, as part of the larger Battle of Vittorio Veneto in the fall of 1918. Even the multiplayer version of this map calls this particular place Montegrappa. However, there are a lot of discrepancies between the actual location and the area depicted in game. It seems that the developers instead took inspiration for modeling from the Falzarigo Pass area, around 122 kilometers north of Montegrappa. We can evidently see this in the first mission from the existence of the Sassa di Stiria mountain, along with the Avarao and Croda Nigra mountains. Also nearby is the Lagazui mountain we climb up later on its foothills. Even the notorious and brutal battle sites that happened during the White War period, such as the Col d'Alana and Muntasif, can be seen in the background. Moreover, the real Montegrappa has tons of steep hills, while the Falzarigo Pass is much flatter and surrounded by mountains, closer to the in-game terrain. So what battle the game is trying to depict here is completely contradictory. The Avarao and Croda Nigra mountains are supposed to be located to the southeast of Sassadistria mountain, not towards the north or northwest as suggested by our compass. The Lagazui mountain should be located to the northeast of Sassadistria, while Coldalana and Mount Asif should be located about 4 kilometers to the southwest of it. In addition, all of the Italian troops among the Dolomites sector were withdrawn in the autumn of 1917 after the Italian defeat at Caporetto, so we shouldn't be in the Falzarigo Pass area during this time. Our first objective is to capture the St. Anastasia Church, which is just a fictional one. Despite the rest of the map being based on real landmarks, no such church of this name, look or location exists in either Falzarigo Pass or Mount Agrappa. A quite interesting note about this war story and location is that not long after this game was released, actual Italian Alpini troops were openly against the portrayal of what they believed to be Monte Grappa in this game. According to the news reports, they said that DICE's decision to portray Monte Grappa as a setting for such a video game was disrespectful, due to it being such a sacred place that should be remembered for those who sacrificed their lives there during the war. They suggested that sensitive topics such as this should be portrayed in different approaches. Well, it is safe to say that they would not react kindly when they later find out how DICE actually portrayed their sacred place in such a contradictory and misleading manner as we have pointed out. Not to even mention the inaccuracy of how, with the exception of a single so-called Alpini outpost that is shown not even being defended by such mountain forces in Mission 2, the game fails to include any proper appearance of Italian Alpini troops that definitely existed and played important roles in the fighting in both the Dolomites sector as a whole and Monte Grappa, along with other Italian units. It is also worth mentioning that during the Third Battle of Monte Grappa, there were a few other nationalities among the Italian Fourth Army that directly attacked the Monte Grappa sector, such as elements of Romanian soldiers, a part of the Romanians in Italy Legion, and some Czechoslovakian personnel that had already enlisted separately in the ordinary Italian units. But of course, none of these soldiers, or even just their corresponding languages or accents, appear in game. Instead of their distinctive early war bluish Hechgrau or mid to late war field grey uniforms, the Austro-Hungarian troops were incredibly inaccurate uniforms, which are almost entirely just copy and pasted versions of the game's German uniforms, but in a slightly bluer tint. This also means that they all have the same problems as the German uniforms and gear mentioned earlier in the prologue. Although this particular case of reused assets was mentioned in the Battlefield 1 art book as being caused by time constraints, it is still undoubtedly a horrible portrayal for this faction. In fact, one of the only bits of actual Austro-Hungarian gear that they wear is their headgear, which consists of almost exclusively burned off helmets and 1908 field caps. But even this is wrong, as the M16/17 Stahlhelm should be far more prevalent at this point, with a handful of burned offers being seen here and there in lesser numbers. A large amount of the Austro-Hungarians and Italian soldiers wear generic ski masks. They should be reduced in numbers and replaced by more period-appropriate balaclava helmets. The same southern German accent voice lines, performed by Munich-born voice actor Louis Friedemann Thiele, are reused for the Austro-Hungarians with slight changes. DICE never gives us the exact date setting of this chapter, but on October 24, 1918, the first day of the Third Battle of Monte Grappa, the Hungarian government did order their own troops to return home, and they did so within a day, leading to decreasing morale and mutinies by other national military units in the later days. So the lack of Hungarians and other nationalities in game does actually make sense, unless the game is trying to depict the first day of the battle, which in that case then it would be somewhat appropriate if we encountered some other nationalities among the army group at Belluno within the Monte Grappa region, and it would certainly be better for there to be more variation of accents among the Austrian German speakers, like Tyrolean and Steiermark accents, rather than hearing just the out-of-place southern German ones we are presented with in game. As for the enemy units in Falzarigo Pass that the game wrongfully tries to portray as the Third Battle of Monte Grappa before the Italian retreat from the Dolomites sector in 1917, the actual Austro-Hungarian units defending this particular sector were mainly the Kaiserjäger regiments. Many of these soldiers were locals from the Tyrolean region. To properly represent this, they should have their own distinctive insignia features on their uniforms, along with proper Tyrolean accents, and as an additional variation, some of them should be able to speak Italian to taunt their enemies enemies and communicate with one another. When performing a partially empty reload with the Mannlicher M1895, the ejected clip is always shown full with 5 rounds in it regardless of how many shots were fired. All of the M1895s are attached with German S98 bayonets with sawback blades, rather than the rifle's actual Austrian M1895 bayonet. Unfortunately, the M1895 is quite literally the only appropriate weapon that the Austro-Hungarians are depicted as having, as all of their other weaponry in-game consist of incorrect aforementioned ones, including the ludicrously rare prototype Hellriegel SMG, anachronistic Portuguese Madsim LMG, out-of-place British Vickers MG, some of which still feature the Russian PM M1910 looking configuration, and the strange Luger hybrid, while among their crates we find the misplaced Mexican Mondragoon, French 1909 Bennett Merci, German MP18, Selbstlader M1916, and Tankgewehr M1918, American Remington Model 10A shotgun, and Winchester Model 1907 rifle with German Mauser grenade launcher, along with the Beretta SMG prototype. They should instead be armed with larger numbers of additional Mannlicher rifle variants, along with other weapons including the Steyr M1912 and regular Frommerstock pistols, Gazer M1870 and Rastangazer M1898 revolvers, and the Schlatzwusa, which was their standard issued machine gun. What is ever more frustrating about the game's mad mix of weapons for them here is that the Austro-Hungarians by this stage of the war did actually have a number of unique automatic weapons which DICE could have used if they wished to continue their insistency of adding non-standard weapons. These would include the Storm Pistol, made by Skoda Verda, which was a copy of the later seen Italian Villa Perosa, the rare Steyr Anschlag Pistola M12, and optionally even rarer Doppel Pistola M12s, fewer rare Frommerstock autos, and a few Frommer machine pistols. Way too many of the Austro-Hungarians are seen armed with the German Wechselapparat and are still wearing the same incorrect flame mask and hood as the Germans. They should be reduced in numbers and given Austrian-made flamethrowers, like the K-Nyne 22L M1915. It is also worth noting that the Arditi side was also known to have used some Italian DLF flamethrowers, yet we don't see any of them in the game. The artillery gun we are tasked with destroying does not match with any artillery pieces used in this area of the Dolomites. The only such steel dome guns we could find in the entirety of the Italian front were single-barreled ones. As pointed out by other internet users, the one in game seems to be similar or inspired by the Turgid Rise turret set up in 1936 as coastal artillery in Dardanelles, Turkey. Despite never being adopted by the Austro-Hungarian forces, the anti-aircraft gun that Lucas solely operates in a full set of armor no less is yet another British Maxim Nordenfelt QF 1-pounder pom-pom. It should be replaced by an appropriate Austro-Hungarian AA gun, such as the 8cm M58 MP. We used the autocannon to shoot down a bunch of Austro-Hungarian aviation troops' planes, including the earlier seen Gotha G4 bomber, which although were actually used by them, there were approximately only 30 or 40 ever deployed on the Italian front, so it is very unlikely that we would encounter and single-handedly destroy so many of them in a single battle. The optional plane to either replace or mix with them would be this recon aircraft, the Hansa Brandenburg C1 that can be equipped with lightweight bombs. This cutscene now shows the Gotha G4s being armed with the Becker type M2 20mm autocannon. Although this weapon was mounted as a test on the earlier Gotha G1, it proved unsuccessful in this role and was not mounted in later Gotha models. They should be Parabellum LMG-14s instead. It also now shows them carrying out-of-place British 112-pound bombs. Among the enemy aircraft is also the earlier seen Fokker D1. In reality, there was only a single prototype variant of this aircraft, known as the MAG Fokker 9003, that ever existed for this unit. To replace this, the Aviatik Berg D1 and or Helberstadt D2 would be more appropriate choices. Multiple examples of the aforementioned very rare and in this case massively misplaced British Pierce Arrow armoured lorries, now with Austro-Hungarian insignia slapped on, are seen below us, but in a rather hilarious act of friendly fire, they are seen evidently getting destroyed by their own Austro-Hungarian aviation troops bombers. Armoured transport vehicles such as the Austro-Daimler M17 or the KFT Scout would be a more reasonable replacement, since the usage of armoured fighting vehicles was very rare for the Austro-Hungarians. For some reason, the Austro-Hungarian squadron decide to cause a landslide by bombarding the nearby Sassadistria mountain. In reality, two of the mountains we mentioned earlier, the Lagazui mountain that we are standing on its foothills right now, along with the infamous Col de Lana and Mount Asif, did actually suffer from explosions by mine bombings, but not aerial bombardments. The depicted aircraft bombing of the Sassadistria mountain did not happen at all, as it still remains intact in reality. Regardless, performing such an attack as this would be nonsensical, as danger close would be a massive issue, especially considering that this mountain was one of the Austro-Hungarian strongholds in this region. Doing something like this would be much more harmful to their own troops rather than to the Italians. The second mission begins with us picking up a fictionalized version of the Villa Perosa. It is actually based on a prop from the 1987 movie The Sicilian, which used two post-World War II MAB-38s welded together upside down with an MG42 grip and a Bren forward grip. Although the real Villa Perosa did have an infantry configuration, the most common version required the user to be prone and use it as more of a light machine gun. We are also equipped with the Beretta Model 1915 pistol, which when reloaded shows its slide getting locked back, which is impossible as the M1915 has no mechanism to lock the slide back besides a magazine cutout. The slide itself is also much too far back, with the front sight cutout being roughly where the ejection port should be. Plus, the magazines being loaded are always shown completely empty. We can find a couple of the enemy crates containing a shortened carbine version of the Mannlicher M1895. Apart from the gun featuring the ridiculous rare Gibbs magnifying lens sight again, drawing it reveals the length of the rear leaf sight from the long rifle, meaning that it is actually a shortened rifle from the interwar period and thus anachronistic. The World War I Karabiner and Stutzen variants have smaller rear sights. The out-of-place MP18s among the Austro-Hungarian crates are now seen incorrectly equipped with bayonets. This is likely to be inspired by the early versions of the post-war MP28 that were capable of being equipped with different kinds of bayonets, but this was not the case for the MP18. Many of the Italian bodies found around this level are wearing what appears to be World War II British Mark 8 goggles, based off of this seemingly poor and incorrect reproduction. Among the enemy corpses in the latter half of this mission are ones that are straight up just the game's models of German soldiers with their grey uniforms and Stahlhelms, even though there weren't any German units in the Third Battle of Monte Grappa or the entire Battle of Vittorio Veneto as a whole. It is possible that these models are appearing as a really poor attempt to represent the late war version of the Austro-Hungarian forces with field grey coloured uniforms and German Stahlhelms, but even if this was the case, then there should be more of them appearing, and much preferably with proper versions of their late war uniform instead of this terrible rendition. In a possible further attempt from the devs to incorrectly include Germans in the battle, the enemy used British armoured AA lorries in this second level feature the aforementioned German Bumfava Anstrich 1918 camouflage and late war Balkenkreuz insignia. Although some Austro-Hungarian aircraft were known to feature similar versions of this cross, it was unlikely that they are put under ground vehicles. One of the lorries is also seen incorrectly armed with a British QF 13-pounder 9 CWT AA gun, which is apparently being operated by some ghosts. As aforementioned, the real Pierce Arrow armoured AA lorries use the QF 2-pounder AA gun. Not that they should even be here in Italy anyway, but I digress. The fort that we attack is seemingly modelled after the real-life Forte Trasassi, while the Lagazui Lake saddle is seen nearby, which are again located near Falzarigo Pass and not Monte Grappa. The real fort was bombarded by the Italians in 1915 and abandoned for a near century afterwards, while the one in-game is still intact and defended by the Austro-Hungarians. The real Forte Trasassi was located on the north or northwest of Sassadistria, not south or southeast as the game depicts. The fort is also depicted as having a sprawling underground tunnel system and bunker complex, which is extremely exaggerated. The only known major tunnel systems built by the Austro-Hungarians in the area would have been the Goginger tunnel that connected from the fort area to nearby Sassadistria mountain, in which the latter became a new stronghold after the fort was bombarded by the Italians. And of course, the real tunnels look nothing like the ones in the game. Because DICE apparently decided that this war story was just not over-dramatized and inaccurate enough, we now see a number of MG08 wielding Austro-Hungarians wearing the same German lobster armor and experimental US arm protection that Luca wore earlier. And of course, they continue to take ridiculous amounts of bullets and explosive damage to neutralize. But not to worry, these armor models are not completely reused, as at least the headgear has now been changed to an Italian bomber pilot helmet. Brilliant. The next story is called The Runner and sees us assume the role of a soldier in the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps or ANZAC during the second day of the April of 1915 British landings on V Beach, Cape Helles, Gallipoli in the Ottoman Empire. Our protagonist, Frederick Bishop, as well as his protege, Foster, are both shown to be wearing 1903 service dresses but in a blue colour. It is likely the case that these are supposed to be stand-ins for the standard issue blue-grey flannel undershirt used by all Commonwealth forces and commonly seen worn without a tunic over it throughout the Gallipoli campaign, but it is still an inaccurate model nonetheless. Frederick also wears a bandolier of the British Martini Henry rifle, introduced in the 1870s. Although he could have technically acquired it from a past conflict, at this stage it would be very outdated, non-standard, and probably not even fit World War I era ammo in it well, due to the fact that the older Martini rounds were a lot bigger. In addition, Bishop has on a 1917 pattern Mark VII rain cape, which did not come into use for another 2 years. Although the British did have different rain cape types in the earlier years of the war, it would not really make much sense for them to be worn in the warm spring climate depicted in game. Despite being a major, Whitehall not only has no rank insignia, but is also dressed as a standard enlisted man, with curiously a unique model of trousers, being khaki wool service dress breeches. Since he holds a high rank and is shown to be stationed at the rear lines for the majority of the campaign, he should instead be utilizing a proper period officer's uniform with the rank insignia of a major. In addition, possibly due to being a reused asset from the one worn earlier by Officer Townsend, the insignia on Whitehall's peaked cap is that of the Tank Corps unit, which was not officially formed until mid-1917, not to mention there weren't any tanks during the Gallipoli campaign. The ship we are on is the SS River Clyde, but according to the compass, we're landing on the east of the Cape, while the real SS River Clyde landed on the southern part of it. As to no one's surprise really, DICE has again messed up the area's terrain details. Although not nearly as bad as the previous Italian missions, Cape Helles is depicted here with numerous steep hills. While the real Cape Helles does have some hills, especially further inland, it is almost near mountainous in-game, which is inaccurate. Terrain like this would be more suitable to represent Anzac Cove instead. Moreover, the overall details of the man-made infrastructures around Cape Helles in-game are much different from the real version. The prime examples are the missing forts and fortified positions, particularly the Sedulbahir fortress, which should be located near the village with the same name, close to the beachhead where the SS River Clyde landed on the V Beach sector. At the very beginning section of Mission 1, and later inside the HQ building in Mission 2, we can inspect the battle plans, which don't even mention anything about the assault on the south of Cape Helles, especially the V Beach sector where we should be located at the start of the story. Despite being infantrymen, our characters are for some reason on the bridge commanding naval bombardments, a task that would be performed by the Navy crew. As a matter of fact, there is a complete absence of any naval personnel. There should definitely be some present since we are engaging in direct combat. In yet another case of a shamelessly reused assets, the ships that shell the shore are several British Iron Duke class dreadnought battleships, some of which being located way too close to the shore. Only 4 of these ships ever existed, and none of them were present in this battle. Instead, all the Iron class battleships were stationed in the North Sea at this time. Along with the SS River Clyde, the other ships that should appear near the V Beach sector would be the HMS Albion, Fleet Sweeper No. 1, some modified civilian trawlers, and 16 ore boats. We start this mission with an SMLE No. 1 Mark III carbine with the experimental and rare Gibbs magnifying lens sight again, while all the other Lee Enfields among her allies have regular iron sights. In the early war period, however, SMLE rifles would be attached with the volley sights as the standard attachment until they were removed from the rifle's production in 1915, but were still present among the rifles of the British troops during the Gallipoli campaign. Instead of having their correct pattern 1907 bayonets, both versions of British SMLE rifles have the aforementioned incorrectly modelled German KS-98 bayonet attached. Our character uses mail bomb grenades, which were not introduced until the following month, May of 1915. A more accurate replacement would be the grenade No. 1 that was already adopted in 1908. Instead of having a proper British pickaxe or any other sort of appropriate melee weapon, Bishop has the Austro-Hungarian Bell Pika as his default melee weapon. The appearance of the woolen warmer climate uniforms exclusively for the British and Anzac soldiers is inaccurate for this setting. While evidence does exist to show these uniforms being used in Gallipoli, they are far too prevalent in game, and more of the soldiers should be utilizing the lightweight khaki drill uniforms in a tan colour, or even just wearing a undershirt without any tunic at all as previously mentioned. Specifically for the Australian soldiers, some of them should be wearing their unique service dress tunic, which differed from the regular British type service dress with its cuffs, pockets, and having a fastening belt. Most of the Allied troops in this chapter have Brodie helmets. This is a major anachronism, as the Brodie began production and was issued during the next year, 1916. As for the British, they should mostly wear peaked caps, optionally with leather trims, and pit or sun helmets, while the Anzac troops also wore the same headgears mixed with proper military slouch hats, not the generic felt hats they wear in game. The British soldiers should also not have SBR small box respirator bags, since these were not first introduced until April of 1916. The reappearance of the experimental American Wilmer eye shields among the British is still obviously massively misplaced, and for this setting also now anachronistic, since it did not come into existence until around 1917. Our protagonists, and likely the Allied AIs wearing felt hats, are Anzac troops. However, the initial assault on Cape Helles was actually conducted by the British 29th Division, making it very unlikely to see this many Anzac troops deployed in this particular sector. The Allied forces that landed on the V Beach area in reality consisted of the 1st Battalion of Royal Dublin Fusiliers and 1st Battalion of Royal Munster Fusiliers, both of which consisting of Irishmen, mixed with the British 2nd Battalion of Hampshire Regiment and other subunits and signallers and engineers. The majority of Anzac forces in this period would have instead landed in a position north of Cape Tepa that would later become known as Anzac Cove. What is even worse about this is that this level's codex, called Battery Beyond, contains much more correct information, with it mentioning the Anzac troops, their initial assault on April 25th, the name of specific locations, and the commander of the Ottomans' 19th Division. This means that DICE did do their research and were fully aware of these facts, yet still completely butchered this location's portrayal by mixing Cape Helles up with Anzac Cove. In yet another blatant example of extremely out of place weapons, white-coloured Russian contract Winchester Model 1895s, American Remington Model 10s, US 1903 Mark I Springfields, and also American Winchester Model 1907s reappear among our Allied soldiers. Their Springfield rifles are seen attached with the experimental Pedersen device that allowed the rifle to fire a 30 caliber pistol type cartridge in semi-automatic mode. This attachment was not even designed until 1917 and was never fielded during World War I. All of these shotguns anachronistically continue to use brass shells. By 1915, the majority of shotgun shells still used wax paper shells. These shells were only replaced by 1917 due to the wet environment presented by trench warfare. Shotgun shells pre-1917 should use a paper texture with either the iconic red colouring or other various civilian coloured shells. Some of the British and Ottoman soldiers have the German anti-tank version of the anachronistic steel Handgranate attached to them. Model 24 steel Handgranates are also seen used by and in the crates of the Ottomans too, next to the TNT with the US World War II plunger again. The British Imperial forces should have their own grenades such as the aforementioned grenade number 1, while the Ottomans should be using Turkish 1914 model or number 2 model hand grenades instead. Just like the earlier Austro-Hungarians, the Ottoman troops in-game are shown to be using retextured German uniforms. While Ottoman uniforms were similar in overall cut and appearance to the German uniforms in reality, they would have of course be lacking the decorative cuffs and buttons on the back, as well as have a different amount of buttons along the front lapel. In addition, the uniform recoloring itself is also incorrect. It is a very light beige color which renders as an almost white in-game, making it match more closely to the ceremonial dress used by the Ottoman forces, and not their combat colors, which would be a darker khaki or tan with some variations depending on materials and dyeing methods. On top of all these other incorrect and misplaced uniform items we mentioned previously, due to the 1915 setting of these levels, even more of these items become completely anachronistic, including the Austro-Hungarian based M1916 or 17 Stahlhelm. Their headgear during this period for regular soldiers and officers alike would be the early versions of the Kavalak with different wearing styles, rather than just the fancy, possibly officers based one present on some of the models in game, in addition to some more variations of regular turbans mixed among them as well for more variations over the single plain coloured kafia model we see on some of them in game too. As well as the M15 Feldmantel coat, not introduced until months later in September of 1915. The Ottomans did have their own double-breasted brown coat, but even this should only really be seen worn in the evening and nighttime missions, rather than seeing them wearing such greatcoats in the Mediterranean spring heat, or even worse, the scorching Arabian desert sun that we see some of them wear it in throughout the following war story. In addition, DICE for some reason decided to add even more incorrect gear on them, which the German models did not originally have, including the aforementioned poorly reproduced World War II British Mark 8 goggles, and some kind of rather impractical empty British Maxim MG belt. Why they decided to give them this much gear is beyond us, considering that historical photographs of Ottomans during the Gallipoli campaign show that they were not as well equipped, with them wearing more puttees than jackboots and there being numerous examples of them using outdated and captured equipment. The Ottoman troops in this game are speaking Turkish with an Istanbul accent, often used by Ottoman officials and high-class people at this time. They should instead have much more dialects and accent variations, including Inner Alatonian, Laz, Kurdish, Eastern Alatonian, along with Agin, and some of them should also be heard speaking Arabic. Throughout the game, we can notice a severe lack of mustaches among the AIs. There was a decline of mustache fashion in Europe, together with new rules among certain factions, especially in 1916, due to difficulties of wearing gas masks, lack of water for shaving, and so on. However, this is not the case for the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, where we can see some of the allies and many Ottoman soldiers featured with mustaches among historical photographs. This also applies strongly to the Arabians we fight alongside in the following war story. Even despite its decline, the fashion evidently stayed existent among some of the combatants during the late war period too, although with mostly short and thin mustache styles. Yet almost every character in the entire campaign mode, especially the enemies, don't have such features at all. The Ottoman soldiers are seen using many of the incorrect aforementioned weapons, consisting of too many German Gewehr 98s, which were not fielded in large scale by them until later in the war, rare C96 carbine prototypes, misplaced American Reventlow Model 10s, way too many assumedly captured British Vickers MGs, some of which still with the Russian PM M1910 looking configuration, post-World War II Portuguese Model Madsen MGs, and at least two sizable amounts of of Austro-Hungarian Mannlicher M1895s, while among their crates we can find the misplaced American Winchester Model 1907 rifle with a German Mauser-type grenade launcher attached, anachronistic MP18, misplaced Italian Sea Regotti, rare anachronistic Self-Sladder M1916, anachronistic MG15NA, which was not utilized by them until later in the war, and misplaced American Browning Auto 5 shotgun. For replacements, in reality the Ottomans did use Mauser rifles built on custom orders with smaller cartridges and some modifications, such as the Mauser Model 1893 and newer 1903. Apart from German rifles, they also used some other kinds, such as the M1874 Peabody Martini rifle and American Winchester 1866 rifles, mainly for the second-rate units and also cavalry for the latter. Even a few captured Lee Enfields would be possible to appear among them too. For handguns, they should have the FN Browning M1903 and Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolver, while their machine gun should consist of specifically the German MG09, which was a smaller cartridge export version of the German MG08, as well as the older Maxim Nordenfeld guns. Some of the anachronistic MP18s we find are experimental burst fire ones, which never existed at any point in history. The two brightly coloured and now anachronistic German Bundfaber Einstrick 1918 camouflage reappears on some of the enemy field guns. The Ottoman forces are seen using only the 77mm German FK96NA as their main field gun. Although the existence of this field gun among the Ottomans in this period might be possible, they began to receive more FK96NAs and other 77mm guns after 1916, and the field guns used in the actual Gallipoli campaign were mostly 75mm, such as the Krupp Field Kanone L30 M1903 as a majority, and Krupp L14 M1904. Since it was not introduced until a year later in 1916 and was unlikely to be used by any other faction apart from Germany during the war, the many Maz S16 shown had by the Ottomans are incorrect. For replacement choices, apart from the Ottoman field guns, they were also known to have used a few 15cm Feldhaubitz 93s, 10.5cm Feldhaubitz M12s, and other kind of artillery pieces during the battle. For specifically the Maz S16s we find in the fortress later, they should be changed into RK-L22 naval guns to match with the ones that were in the actual Sed-Dul-Bahir fortress at the V Beach sector during the battle.
Not Kiwi, eh?
The term Kiwi is a more frequent term to describe New Zealanders nowadays. Back during this time period, they would rather be known as Fernleafs and Fernlanders. There are a number of discrepancies with the depiction of the village of Sed-Dul-Bahir, with even the individual buildings being off, such as this one, which has an attached minaret tower, indicating it to be a mosque. However, when we go inside, we see that the interior setup and furnishing is that of just a regular house. We can also find a large bathhouse within the village that we have to defend fiercely as one of our objectives. However, we can't find any trace of its existence in the battle, and bathhouses like this were somewhat luxurious buildings in Ottoman times that usually existed in cities, making it questionable for it to be in such a place as this.
The Allied position is lost. Artillery fire ordered to cover retreat to beach, shelling the village and outlying forts.
A full-scale retreat of the British forces from Cape Helles never happened on the second or third day after the landing. Those who retreated from the beachhead sectors of the Cape during this period were actually the Ottomans. Among the Ottoman soldiers, we once again encountered the absurd bullet sponge ones, wearing the now anachronistic German lobster armor and elephant masks, with experimental US arm protection, armed with the MG08, which was a machine gun not used by the Ottomans in any large scale until later in the war. The existence of this Fort Nobet, as the game calls it, is fictional. According to its position, this is likely to be inspired by a fortification north of the Sed-Dul-Bahir village, known to the British as Hill 141, combined together with the aforementioned Sed-Dul-Bahir fortress that was missing from the campaign. Surprisingly enough, to DICE's credit, they did go back and recreate Cape Helles slightly more accurately for a map in the Turning Tides expansion of this game's multiplayer, which does include the Sed-Dul-Bahir fortress and Hill 414, but even this map is off too, with it failing to include the village nearby the fortress and still having the two large hills. Throughout the campaign, we can see the aforementioned Austrian 1910 shovels as the only kind of entrenching tool used by the Ottomans. In reality, they didn't use a specific entrenching tool model, and rather used pretty much any shovels and tools they could find, including regular farming shovels. Also note that the Ottomans weren't heavily industrialized as the European nations at this time, and many of their stuff didn't have models like the European armies did. Many of them were produced with slight differences in every copy because they are mostly handcrafted instead of made with machinery. We can see a Bristol F-2 fighter flying above the fortress, even though its first flight was not until the following year in September of 1916. Apart from just being a recolored copied model from the already incorrect German and Austro-Hungarian flame troopers, the Ottoman flame troopers still also are armed with the German Wechselapparat, not introduced until 1916. There are no actual reports of flamethrowers being used during the Gallipoli campaign, and it's unlikely that the Ottomans received any such weapon during this time. In the closing text, it states that the Anzac and allies continued to fight for 9 months, but it was rather 8 months in reality. It also mentions that almost 100,000 Ottoman soldiers gave their lives in the battle. However, several sources point out differently, ranging from more than 50k to around 86k of the deaths among the casualty figures of the Ottoman side, none of which exactly match with the near 100k figure presented in game. The following war story, Nothing is Written, brings us to the Ottoman Hejaz railway and sees us fight alongside Bedouin rebels during the Arab revolt in the spring of 1918. For the setting of this chapter, the intro text only mentions Al-Adjar, Mesopotamia. With our research, we found the only place with this name actually related with the Hejaz railway being a remote train station located to the southeast of Tabuk in the Hejaz region known as Al-Adjar station. However, the game is vague about the location and represents it as the name of a fictional town or region. Even worse, the station and the entire Hejaz railway isn't located anywhere within or near the Mesopotamia region, which is nowadays Iraq and its surrounding areas. Here we see a map of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, but a number of the islands are incorrectly marked as still being within Ottoman territory, first being Cyprus, a former territory that was lost to the British in 1878. Next is Rhodes Island, which was lost to Italy in 1912, and then there's Lesbos and Chios Islands, which were lost to Greece in 1912 and 1913 respectively.
Small bands of Bedouin rebels have united to overthrow the empire. They strike without warning and then vanish into the desert. Fighting alongside them is a lone British officer, whose exploits have earned him wide renown. The world has taken to calling this man Lawrence of Arabia.
T.E. Lawrence, also known as the Lawrence of Arabia, was a real British officer who fought alongside the Bedouin Arab rebels. However, describing him as a lone British officer does not really match up, and is possibly a case of the game just going along with Lawrence's controversial narrative in his accounts. Throughout the story and in the game's codexes, there is no mention of any other European figure who directly assisted the revolt apart from Gertrude Bell. For our recommendation, it would be better if they at least mentioned France's contribution, along with Captain Rosario Pisani, together with other notable British military advisors who were also involved in the revolt, and maybe some prominent Arab leaders apart from Sheriff Hussein bin Ali that they mention in the Bedouin Codex. Despite being found among the Ottomans, the horses in this story continue to have mostly allied gear on, with our protagonist still always being equipped with the British pattern 1796 light cavalry sabre and Russian contract Winchester model 1895 when riding them. In reality, the Ottoman cavalry usually use the M1905 and also the aforementioned US-made Winchester rifles and or carbines. Despite being deep within Ottoman territory, pretty much all of the bags, containers, tobacco boxes and other such items have English writing on them. While seeing Ottomans with Stahlhelms in the previous campaign was incorrect due to it taking place in 1915, it is actually correct for a handful of assault units to be using them at this latter point in the war. That being said, they should not be shown in a tan or white colour, they should be a darker steel tone, and should also not be seen with full-length visors, as Ottoman Stahlhelms had visors cut down. The existence of German weapons like the Gewehr 98, Granatwerfer 16, and FK-96NA field guns among the Ottoman troops here in this 1918 time setting now makes more sense. However, we still find many of the other incorrect weapons we mentioned them using and having in their crates in the previous chapter, now also alongside even more inaccurate ones, including the strange PO8 hybrid, Italian M1918 Automatico prototype Canadian Huat, solely German used tank Gewehr, out of place US M1903 and M1911, misplaced Mexican Mondragoon, never adopted British 1.59 inch breech loading Vickers QF gun Mark II, Austro-Hungarian hatchet, and World War II era British limpet mines. These should be removed and replaced by all the suggested weapons we mentioned in the previous The Runner story, along with, due to the late war setting, a more acceptable appearance of proper versions of the MG08 and MG15NA as well. A rather frustrating detail on this note is that the Ottoman soldiers in Mission 2 of this story can be heard having dialogue mentioning the Mauser Model 1903 and the M1874 Peabody Martini rifles, which they actually used in reality, thus why we suggested them as replacements earlier.
Hala Martin kullanırlar bilir misin? 18. asırdan yadigar o eski tek atımlık tüfek.
We can even see the Martini Henry rifles being used by the Arab rebels throughout the story, which the devs could have used for the Ottomans for a more accurate portrayal, being yet another fine example of DICE showing that they knew and could have implemented the correct details, yet still decided to instead butcher their depictions by adding so many of these incredibly misplaced, anachronistic or rare prototype guns instead. As pointed out by one of our Turkish associates, always AFK, the wording used in this codebook is off, such as how it misspells the word muhabir as muhabera and also refers to the Ottoman Empire as Osmanli İmparatorluğu, which is a term that was founded post-1923. Ottoman era documents call the state Devleti Ali Osmaniye or Devleti-i Osmaniye. The Ottoman officer or commander uniforms in this chapter are just another recolored German tunic in a very dark khaki color that presents as an almost black color in the game's lighting. They of course again feature no rank insignia and do not match with the look and the design of the real Ottoman officer uniforms. It is possible that the colors might be inspired by the portrayal of Mustafa Kemal and his officers from the Gallipoli 2015 TV series, while the regular soldiers with the very light beige uniforms might be inspired from the ones in the Turkish 2012 movie called Gallipoli 1915. The main character of this story is revealed in this scene to be a woman named Zara Gufran, who doesn't seem to have any specific historical basis or inspiration. Female roles in the Arab revolt were minimal at best, such as fighting off Ottoman raids on villages. The Bedouin were quite patriarchal, and Lawrence of Arabia himself even mentioned that the Arabs were shocked at the Ottomans' brutality against women, for it violated Islamic customs and traditions. If DICE wanted to tell the story of women in active combat roles, perhaps they could have instead looked at the stories of Eugenie Shakoshka or Flora Sandes, and some others that the game itself even mentions in the Women Rise Codex. The Ottomans are seen driving a civilian Dodge Model 30 converted into a full military scout car with an MG mounted on it. This vehicle was mainly used by the US military, and this converted version presented in-game with the mounted MG is unlikely to have existed. It should be replaced by perhaps a Mercedes 3795 staff car, which they could have been supplied with from their ally Germany, who were known to have fought alongside the Ottomans in these territories. Since Western-styled uniforms were generally unpopular and highly disliked among the Bedouin tribes, Zara, along with the Arabians and even T.E. Lawrence himself, wearing parts of these kinds of uniforms during the conflict is something that's outright inaccurate. They should pretty much all be wearing longer abayas as seen in historical pictures. This Canavar armored train model is actually just a fictional one based on the Zamorets, the Russian armored train from the game's multiplayer, which was obviously never used by the Ottomans in reality. Despite the major purpose of the raids on the Hejaz railway being to destroy the strength and capabilities of the Ottoman troops that got surrounded in the city of Medina during the siege of Medina, the game and codexes do not mention anything about this important battle in the region at all. Instead, the Hejaz railway codex just mentions Medina as a destination of the railway and nothing else. The entire map in Mission 2 and 3 is just a reused multiplayer map called Sinai Desert, a different place that's not related to anything with the Hejaz railways in the first place. So it's not surprising to us to see that when compared with some photos of the actual Al-Adjar station to the maps shown in game, it becomes safe to say that the terrain and buildings are portrayed in a fictional and exaggerated manner. Also, according to the satellite maps and on-site photographs of the areas, there are not supposed to be any ancient archaeological sites nearby at all.
The Ottoman Empire brought in the modern world with a host of armoured vehicles.
The Ottomans never used tanks during World War I, with Turkey receiving run-out FTs only after the war ended, and the Ottoman Empire had already collapsed. Not to mention there's no explanation to how Zara, a Bedouin, could be able to operate the vehicle single-handedly. The Ottoman tankers were just a recolored version of the same generic overalls with the anachronistic zippers that we saw the British and Germans wear earlier, along with the rather out-of-place British anti-splinter tank mask again. If we start playing the second Young Man's Work mission from the main menu, in addition to her SMLE with the green luminous night sight again, Zara is also armed with the Webley Fosbury auto revolver, and in the following mission she starts with the outdated Lancaster Houda pistol. The Webley Fosbury auto revolver also appears used by the Arab rebels, and one is even found by T.E. Lawrence in a captured enemy vehicle later. As aforementioned, since the use of both of these handguns during World War I was very limited, they should instead be far more common Webley 4 or 5 and 6s, or even the Smith & Wesson No. 3 revolver which they could have captured from the Ottomans. Both the removed AA gun version and incorrect QF 13-pounder 9 CWT AA gun armed version of the rare British Pierce Arrow armoured AA lorry return, this time in a beige colour and used by the Ottomans. The markings on the captured Renault FT tanks and Pierce Arrow lorries is a black square with a white outline, a symbol used by the Ottoman air branch during the war. We can find an Ottoman soldier single-handedly operating a Marder 16 to somehow with pinpoint accuracy fire at British Mark V tanks that are for some reason driving around in the complete open desert at night. It would be very unlikely that there would be any British forces in this area since their advancement up north should be located much closer to the Mediterranean Sea. The rounds that the Ottomans load into the Marder 16 and are found all around them are the aforementioned rare, way too small model version of the British BL 15-inch shell, while the British 18-pounder high explosive or HE shells also reappear all over the Ottoman territories too. We even could find the 15-inch howitzer rounds sitting right next to the FK96 NAs in the previous chapter. In reality, there was only one of the British 15-inch howitzers that were brought to Gallipoli, but it never made it to the shore, making all of these shells' appearances in these settings even more inaccurate. We are tasked with seizing the Ottoman commander's satchels, but when we kill them we see that the said satchels are always British 1908 small packs. The aforementioned World War II American-looking medical tents with the Red Cross symbols make their appearance here. The actual Ottoman field hospital tents look different at this time, and although the involvement of the Red Cross in Ottoman territories during the war is accurate, they were working together with the Ottoman version of the Red Cross known as the Red Crescent as well. The Red Cross symbol seen on the tents in game was actually disliked by the Ottomans, even before World War I, and this led to the creation of the Red Crescent in the first place. Thus, the appearance of only the Red Cross symbol in such a place is utmost questionable. Mounted behind the armoured train is a 38cm SKL-45 Max or Long Max. Only 8 of these guns were ever produced and were only used by Imperial Germany. Accompanying the train are Fokker D1s with Ottoman markings. There are no sources of its usage among the Ottoman air branch in reality. The better candidates for replacement would be the aforementioned Albatros D3 and or AEG C4. Many other allied Arab fighters are armed with the MP-18, although there was a possible existence of this gun during the Turkish War of Independence after the First World War, which led to certain assumptions that the Germans might actually have sent some to the Ottomans in 1918. There wasn't any official report of its usage by the Ottoman forces during World War I, and a massive amount of them being used by the Arabs here already in early 1918 is utterly incorrect. Thus they should be replaced with British supplied weapons like the SMLE, captured enemy rifles and other such weapons. Instead of using local Arabic languages, like a second version of Hejazi Arabic for those living in rural areas and among the Bedouin people, the Arab fighters here shout reused English voice lines.
Have this! Keep firing, boy!
After destroying the train, Lawrence strongly indicates to Zara that they are next going to perform a raid on Ottoman battleships in the Suez Canal.
And you're right, we do need to think bigger, act bigger. Maybe even the Suez Canal. Tell me, what do you know about battleships?
Historically speaking, however, as noted by one of our original sources, the Situation Excellent blog, despite 2 attempts to attack it by the Ottomans early in World War I, the British held control of the Suez Canal throughout the war. At this stage of the conflict in 1918, none of the few Ottoman battleships were present at the Suez Canal because they had already been either captured by the British, sunk, or stuck in port due to bad damages. It is also possible that this dialogue could be interpreted as Lawrence referring to the ships belonging to the British or Allied forces, that we can only assume he might plan to do something against in correlation to the upcoming Sykes-Picot Treaty, but this seems quite unlikely. Some might also say that this could be a reference to one of the game's multiplayer maps called Suez, which features a damaged ship. However, this ship is just another one of the British Iron Duke class dreadnought battleships again, none of which were present or destroyed in the Suez Canal anyway, and according to the Battlefield Wiki and their webpage, this map is set during the Ottoman raid on the Suez Canal in 1915, 3 years before this chapter. So no matter how one chooses to stretch or view it, this line does not really make sense historically or logically. The game has a 1.5 minute long epilogue, which claims to be, quote, a closing message from the Battlefield 1 team dedicated to those who served. But oh my, is this some cartoonishly inaccurate dedication, for it shows the following. We see an Ottoman wearing a German lobster armor plate, succumbing to friendly fire from the same Zamords-based train that was just made out to be an Ottoman one in the last war story. Our Hellfighter character from the prologue is now seen here not only still of course wearing his almost entirely British uniform, but also now armed with a British SMLE rifle. As we established earlier, the Hellfighters were mostly equipped with French firearms, and never fought alongside British forces within their territories. This makes the chances of the weapon being picked up by our character from a fallen British soldier extremely unlikely, and without any explanation from the game, inaccurate. This shot shows us as assumedly a British soldier armed with an out-of-place Mondragoon rifle, of course, alongside fellow British troops and a French Renault FT with the aforementioned post-World War I British Royal Air Force roundel on it. The British Army only used 24 Renault FTs throughout the war in reality, and they were used for liaison and commanding roles, usually with the gun removed. Here is the game's multiplayer model for a British medic, who is wearing a World War II era German medical bag. The German L-30 Zeppelin is now seen fighting over Falzarigo Pass, despite it and all of the other R-class Zeppelins being very unlikely to have operated in this area, and certainly not in such a low-flying frontline attack as this. This shot is captured from inside a French Renault FT on the Lagazui mountain, fighting alongside Italian soldiers, with another FT being to our left that features an aircraft roundel of the Italian Military Aviation Corps. Also, in reality, Italy only received 3 or 4 Renault FTs in 1918, all of which most likely saw no combat and would be impossible to have been fielded here in Falzarigo Pass, considering the aforementioned fact that the Italians had retreated from this sector since 1917. Despite being widely regarded as a very grounded, respectful, authentic, and some even going as far as to state historically accurate game, especially when compared to certain other notorious Battlefield titles, after analysing Battlefield 1, we have reached a channel record total of over 350 historical inaccuracies. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to play it now for free using my link in the description and pinned comment for all new and returning players that haven't played in 6 months. To receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms, available for a limited time only. For more, click on this video where we cover the many errors of this game's downright disrespectful and disingenuous sequel, Battlefield 5. Massive thanks to our research team including Jay, Karabiny, Davidson, FeReise, K-Nyne, Pollock Madlad, Shenn, Munancho Inc, AdriaNsteam, Always AFK, and the other members of our YouTube and Discord community. And of course, thank you for watching. This has been the Frosty one, out.